Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Badlands of South Dakota, 3 miles east of the Sage Creek Wilderness area, in October of last year. I should have known better than to go alone. Everyone told me that. My sister, my co-workers, even the park ranger who issued my backcountry permit with a barely concealed frown. But I needed the solitude. After finding Marcus in our bed with his yoga instructor, after the screaming fights and the lawyer meetings and the gut-wrenching division of 5 years' worth of shared possessions, I craved nothing more than silence and space. I had Diesel with me at least. My 3-year-old German Shepherd mix had been the one thing Marcus didn't fight me for in the breakup, probably because he knew the dog had never liked him anyway. Diesel's dark eyes had always been uncommonly intelligent, almost human in their expressiveness, and he'd taken to following me everywhere since Marcus left. It was like he could sense my fragility. The weather forecast promised 3 days of clear skies in the remote backcountry east of the Pinnacles. I'd hiked this area before, though never alone, and I knew the terrain well enough. Rolling prairie dotted with eroded spires and deep gullies, the kind of landscape that made you feel insignificant under the vast South Dakota sky, perfect for disappearing for a while. I parked my Subaru at the trailhead just after dawn on a Thursday in mid-October. The parking area was empty except for a rusty Ford pickup with Montana plates that looked like it had been there for days. Probably some hunter, I told myself, though deer season wouldn't start for another week. I strapped on my pack, clipped Diesel's leash to my belt, and headed into the wilderness. The first day passed without incident. I made good time despite the weight of my pack, following a faint game trail through the short grass prairie. Diesel trotted beside me, ears alert, occasionally darting off to investigate interesting scents before returning to my side. The October air was crisp but not cold, perfect hiking weather. By evening, I'd covered nearly 8 miles and found a suitable campsite in a small depression between 2 weathered rock formations. I should have paid more attention to how Diesel behaved that first night. He refused to settle down, instead pacing the perimeter of our camp with his hackles raised. Every few minutes he'd stop and stare into the darkness beyond the circle of my headlamp, a low growl rumbling in his chest. When I called to him, he'd look at me with what I can only describe as concern, then resume his restless patrol. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, following his gaze into the black prairie. The night was moonless, and beyond the weak beam of my light lay an ocean of darkness so complete it seemed solid. Just prairie dogs, maybe a coyote. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. Diesel had encountered plenty of wildlife before, and had never acted like this. This was different. This was fear. I'd brought a camp stove, but I also built a small fire from dried buffalo grass and scattered deadwood. Fires were legal in this area, and the flames provided a comforting bubble of warmth and light. Diesel finally settled down once the fire was going, though he positioned himself between me and the darkness, his dark fur blending into the shadows at the edge of the firelight. I tried to read, but the words kept blurring together. The silence out here was different from what I'd expected. Back home in Rapid City, silence meant the absence of traffic, of neighbors, of the thousand small sounds of civilization. But this silence felt active, almost predatory. It pressed against my eardrums like something alive. Around midnight, I heard the first sound. It was distant, maybe a quarter mile away, the unmistakable sound of someone calling for help. A man's voice, rough and desperate. "Hello? Can anyone hear me? I'm lost." Diesel's head snapped up, ears forward. He let out a single sharp bark in response. I grabbed my headlamp and stood up, scanning the darkness. "Hello?" I called back. "Are you okay? Help me." The voice came again, closer now. I've been walking for hours. I can see your fire. My heart hammered as I tried to spot movement in the darkness. A lost hiker was serious business out here, especially at night. The nearest road was at least 6 miles away, and the terrain was treacherous even in daylight. I'd heard stories of people falling into hidden gullies and breaking bones, or becoming disoriented and walking in circles until they died of exposure. "Keep talking," I shouted. "I'll try to guide you in." But Diesel had other ideas. He planted himself directly in front of me and let out a long, menacing growl that made my blood run cold. His lips were pulled back from his teeth, and the fur along his spine stood up like a ridge. "Diesel, what?" The voice called out again, but this time something was wrong with it. It was the same words, the same tone, but there was an odd echo quality to it, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well. And it seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. "Help me! I'm lost!" Then, impossibly, I heard my own voice calling back, "Keep talking. I'll try to guide you in." My mouth hadn't moved. The words came from somewhere out in the darkness, a perfect reproduction of what I'd said moments before, but with that same strange, hollow quality. Diesel's growl intensified. He backed up against my legs, still facing outward, his entire body trembling with tension. "Hello?" The man's voice again, but now it sounded exactly like mine. "Are you okay?" I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my sleeping bag. My hands shook as I reached for the bear spray clipped to my pack. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human. The voices continued for another hour, an endless loop of my words and the stranger's, echoing back and forth across the prairie like some demented conversation. Sometimes they overlapped, creating a nauseating cacophony of sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was even worse than the voices. It felt expectant, as if something was waiting just beyond the dying light of my fire. I fed more grass to the flames and sat pressed against Diesel's warm flank, both of us staring into the darkness until dawn. When the sun finally rose, painting the eroded landscape in shades of gold and red, I felt foolish. In daylight, the night's events seemed impossible, like a nightmare half remembered upon waking. I broke camp quickly, eager to put distance between myself and whatever had happened in the dark. The second day's hike should have been routine. The terrain was familiar, the weather clear, the trail well marked by game sign and my own GPS, but something was wrong from the moment I started walking. My GPS kept losing signal, displaying impossible coordinates that placed me anywhere from Canada to Mexico. When I pulled out my paper map and compass as backup, the needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. Even more disturbing, landmarks I remembered from previous hikes were in the wrong places. A distinctive rock formation that should have been to my south loomed on my northern horizon instead. Diesel seemed as confused as I was. He kept stopping to sniff the air, his tail tucked low, occasionally whining in a way I'd never heard before. Once he suddenly bolted 20 yards ahead, barking frantically at something I couldn't see. When I caught up to him, there was nothing there but a patch of disturbed earth and the overwhelming stench of decay. By midday, I was seriously considering turning back. The landscape around me looked wrong, twisted somehow, as if I was seeing it through a funhouse mirror. Familiar rock formations seemed subtly altered, their shadows falling at impossible angles despite the sun's position directly overhead. That's when I saw the hiker. He was maybe 100 yards ahead, a tall figure in faded blue jeans and a red flannel shirt, walking away from me along what looked like a well-used trail. Normal. Human. The first sign of civilization I'd seen since leaving the trailhead. "Hey," I called out, my voice hoarse from thirst and relief. "Wait up!" The figure stopped and turned toward me. Even at that distance, I could see him wave. He seemed to be saying something, but the words didn't carry across the wind. Diesel, who had been trotting beside me, suddenly sat down hard and refused to move. When I tugged on his leash, he planted his paws and pulled backward with all his strength. "Come on, boy," I coaxed. "It's just another hiker. Maybe he can help us figure out where we are." But Diesel wasn't having it. He let out a high, anxious whine and tried to drag me back the way we'd come. His eyes were wide with terror, the whites showing around the dark irises. I unclipped his leash and started toward the other hiker on my own. Behind me, Diesel barked once, sharp and urgent, but I ignored him. I needed human contact, needed confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind out here. The distance between us closed quickly, too quickly. One moment the hiker was 100 yards away, the next he was 50, then 20. But his stride never seemed to change. It was like watching someone walk on a treadmill while the landscape scrolled past beneath his feet. When I got close enough to make out his features, my step faltered. He was wrong. Everything about him was wrong. His face was too pale, the color of old bone. His eyes were completely black, no iris or pupil visible, just empty darkness that seemed to swallow light. But worst of all was his smile. It was too wide, stretching from ear to ear in a rictus grin that no human face could sustain. "Hello, Sarah," he said, and his voice was the same one that had called for help in the darkness. "I've been waiting for you." I turned and ran. Behind me, I could hear him laughing, a sound like breaking glass and winter wind. But when I risked a glance over my shoulder, he wasn't following. He was just standing there, that terrible smile still plastered across his face, watching me flee. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like rubber, expecting at any moment to feel his hands on my back or hear his footsteps gaining ground. But the sounds of pursuit never came. When I finally stopped, gasping and shaking, I was alone on the prairie with nothing but the whisper of wind through the grass. Diesel found me an hour later, appearing out of a nearby gully like a black and tan ghost. He pressed against my side, whimpering, and I buried my face in his fur and tried to convince myself that I'd hallucinated the entire encounter. That night, I didn't bother with a fire. I'd intended to camp in a small grove of cottonwoods I remembered from previous hikes, but when I reached the coordinates on my map, there was nothing there but open grassland. The trees, if they'd ever existed, were gone. Instead, I made a cold camp in a shallow depression between two low hills, hoping the terrain would hide me from whatever was stalking these badlands. I ate cold food straight from the packages and tried not to think about the strange hiker's black eyes or impossible smile. Diesel was agitated again, pacing and whining, but this time his attention seemed focused on the sky. When I followed his gaze upward, I saw why. The stars were wrong. I'd grown up in South Dakota, had spent countless nights under these skies. I knew the constellations as well as I knew my own reflection. But the patterns above me tonight belonged to no season I'd ever seen. Orion hung low in the eastern sky where he had no business being in October. The Big Dipper was upside down, and there, blazing like a beacon in the southern sky, was the Southern Cross, visible only from below the equator. I closed my eyes and counted to 10, certain that when I opened them the stars would be back in their proper places. But when I looked again, the alien constellation still wheeled overhead, cold and indifferent and utterly wrong. "It's okay," I whispered to Diesel, though my voice shook. "It's going to be okay. We'll hike out in the morning and everything will be normal again." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Whatever was happening to us, it was far beyond my understanding. The landscape was shifting around us like a living thing, warping the very laws of physics and geography. We weren't just lost. We were somewhere else entirely. Diesel settled down beside me, but he didn't sleep. Neither did I. We lay there in the dark, listening to the night sounds that weren't quite right either. The coyote calls that lasted too long and hit notes no animal throat could produce. The wind that whispered words in languages I didn't recognize. The sound of footsteps circling our camp, always just at the edge of hearing. I must have dozed near dawn because I woke to find Diesel gone. Panic shot through me like lightning. I sat up so fast my head spun, scanning the empty prairie in all directions. There was no sign of him anywhere, no tracks, no disturbed earth, nothing to indicate where he might have gone. "Diesel," I called, my voice cracking with fear. "Here, boy, come back." Silence answered me, vast and oppressive. Even the ever-present wind had died to nothing, leaving the world eerily still. I spent the morning searching, following game trails and climbing the highest rocks to scan the horizon. I called his name until my throat was raw, but there was no response. It was as if he'd simply vanished, swallowed by the hungry earth itself. By noon, I had to accept the horrible truth. Diesel was gone, and I was alone. The loneliness hit me like a physical blow. For the past year, through all the chaos and heartbreak of my divorce, Diesel had been my constant companion. His warm presence at my side had been the one thing I could count on, the one relationship that hadn't crumbled into acrimony and lawyers' letters. Now, even that was gone, and the vast emptiness of the Badlands felt like a living thing pressing in around me. I should have started hiking back toward my car immediately, should have followed my GPS coordinates, if they could be trusted, and gotten out of this nightmare landscape as fast as possible. Instead, I sat down on a sun-warmed rock and cried until I had no tears left. When I finally pulled myself together and checked my map, I realized with growing horror that I had no idea where I was. The landmarks I'd been using to navigate were gone, or altered beyond recognition. The GPS showed coordinates that couldn't possibly be correct, and without Diesel's superior senses to guide me, I felt more lost than I'd ever been in my life. I picked a direction that felt like east and started walking, hoping to eventually intersect the trail that had brought me into this place. The sun beat down mercilessly and my water supply was running low. I rationed myself to small sips, but I could feel dehydration beginning to set in despite the cool October air. That's when I heard him calling, "Sarah, Sarah, where are you?" I spun around, my heart leaping with joy and relief. It was Diesel's bark, distant but unmistakable. He'd found his way back to me somehow. "Diesel, I'm here, boy. Come to me." The barking continued, seeming to come from a cluster of eroded rock formations about a quarter-mile to my north. I ran toward the sound, stumbling over loose stones and prairie dog holes in my haste to reach him. "Sarah, help me!" I stopped running. That last call hadn't been a bark. It had been a human voice, my voice, calling for help. But I was standing alone on the prairie. I hadn't spoken. "Sarah," the voice called again, and this time I could hear that wrong, hollow quality I remembered from the first night. "I'm hurt. I can't move." The barking resumed, sharp and desperate, definitely coming from the rocks ahead. But now I could hear something else underneath it, a low, rhythmic panting that sounded more like laughter than exhaustion. I backed away slowly, my skin crawling with the certainty that this was a trap. Whatever was out there was using Diesel's voice to lure me closer, just as it had used the lost hiker's cries on the first night. But what if I was wrong? What if Diesel really was hurt, trapped in some crevice between the rocks? What if I was abandoning him to save myself? The internal debate raged for long minutes while the calls continued, Diesel's barks alternating with my own voice pleading for help. The sounds were definitely coming from the rocks, maybe 50 yards away now. If I approached carefully, stayed alert for any sign of danger. I took a step forward, then another. The barking grew more excited, more urgent. Almost there now. Just a few more yards and I'd be able to see into the shadows between the rock formations. That's when I noticed the smell. It rolled toward me on the still air like a physical wave. The sweet, cloying stench of decay so strong it made my eyes water. Underneath it was something else, something that reminded me of wet fur and old meat and things that should have been buried long ago. I turned and ran without looking back. Behind me, the barking stopped abruptly, replaced by that glass and winter wind laughter I remembered from the day before. But this time it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, echoing off the rocks and rolling across the prairie like thunder. "Sarah!" the voice called after me, stretching my name into a mocking sing-song. "Don't you want to see your doggy again?" I ran until my legs gave out. then crawled behind a low boulder and pressed my face against the warm stone, trying to muffle my sobs. Whatever had taken Diesel, it was using him now as bait, twisting his voice into a lure designed to draw me to my death. But the worst part was the knowledge that it might actually be him calling, that the thing stalking me might have done something to my dog, changed him somehow while leaving just enough of his original nature intact to make the trap convincing. The sun was setting by the time I felt safe enough to move again. I'd been hiding behind the boulder for hours, listening for any sign of pursuit, but the prairie had returned to its usual wind-whispered silence. My water was nearly gone, and I hadn't eaten since morning. If I didn't find shelter soon, exposure would kill me long before whatever was hunting me got the chance. I stumbled through the gathering dusk, no longer caring about direction or destination. My only goal was to put distance between myself and the rocks where I'd heard those terrible sounds. The rational part of my mind knew I should be conserving my energy, moving in a straight line toward the most likely location of help, but rationality had abandoned me somewhere around the time the stars stopped making sense. Full dark caught me in the open, with no shelter more substantial than a few scattered boulders. I made camp, if it could be called that, between two rocks that offered minimal protection from the wind, and tried to ignore the gnawing hunger in my stomach and the bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. That's when I saw the fire. It was small and distant, maybe half a mile away, flickering like a star that had fallen to earth. Someone else was out here, another camper or hiker who might have food and water and, most importantly, a working GPS to guide us back to civilization. I gathered what little remained of my gear and started toward the light, using my headlamp to navigate the treacherous terrain. It seemed to take forever to close the distance, as if the fire was retreating even as I approached it. But eventually I got close enough to make out details. It was a proper campfire, built in a ring of stones with a neat pile of firewood stacked nearby. A tent was pitched just beyond the circle of light, and a figure sat on a log beside the flames, silhouetted against the orange glow. "Hello," I called out as I approached. "Are you okay? I'm lost and could really use some help." The figure turned toward me, and even from 50 yards away I could see the gleam of teeth in what might have been a smile. "Sarah, I've been waiting for you." The voice was mine again, but wrong. Like a recording played at the wrong speed, or words spoken by someone who had learned the sounds without understanding their meaning. I stopped walking. In the firelight, I could see the figure more clearly now, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. It was me. Or something wearing my face anyway. The same dark hair, the same hiking clothes I'd been wearing 3 days ago, even the same silver bracelet my sister had given me for my birthday. But the proportions were subtly wrong, as if someone had tried to recreate a human being from memory and gotten the details slightly off. The arms were too long, the head cocked at an unnatural angle, and those eyes, black as midnight and empty as the space between stars. "I've been so lonely," my doppelganger said, its voice a perfect mimicry of my own inflection and tone. "Won't you come sit by the fire? We have so much to talk about." I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the thing that wore my face. It didn't seem inclined to follow, content to sit by its fire and watch me retreat. But as I reached the edge of the light, I heard something that made my heart stop. A bark. Diesel's bark, coming from inside the tent. "Oh yes," the not-me said, noticing my reaction. "I found your dog. He's been asking for you." Against every instinct I possessed, I took a step forward, if there was even a chance that Diesel was alive in there. "Here, boy," I called softly. "Come here, Diesel." Movement inside the tent, then the sound of a zipper being pulled down. A familiar black and tan shape emerged into the firelight, tail wagging. It was Diesel. It had to be. The same markings, the same intelligent eyes, even the small scar on his left ear from a childhood accident. But when he looked at me, there was no recognition in his gaze. No joy at seeing me after our long separation. Just that same empty, predatory intelligence I'd seen in the fake hiker's eyes. "He's been such good company," my double said, reaching out to stroke Diesel's head with fingers that bent in directions fingers shouldn't bend. "We've been practicing, haven't we, boy?" Diesel, or the thing that looked like Diesel, opened its mouth and spoke. "Sarah," it said in a perfect reproduction of my voice, "help me. I'm lost." I ran screaming into the darkness. Behind me, laughter echoed across the prairie. Two voices now, mine and something else's, harmonizing in a sound no human throat could produce. But underneath it all, growing louder as I fled, was the sound of breathing. Deep, rhythmic, hungry breathing that seemed to chase me across the broken landscape like a living thing. I don't remember much of that night. I ran until I collapsed, crawled until I could crawl no more, then lay shivering in whatever shelter I could find until the first pale light of dawn gave me the courage to move again. My water was gone, my food exhausted, and I could feel my body beginning to shut down from dehydration and exposure. But I was alive. Whatever those things were, they seemed content to toy with me rather than kill me outright. Perhaps they fed on fear rather than flesh. Perhaps they were saving me for something worse than death. The fourth day passed in a haze of thirst and delirium. I stumbled across the landscape without direction or purpose, following game trails that led nowhere and chasing mirages that dissolved at my approach. The sun seemed to move wrong in the sky, sometimes racing overhead in moments, sometimes hanging motionless for hours at a time. I was dying. I knew that with perfect clarity even as my rational mind began to fray at the edges. But I was too stubborn or too scared to simply lie down and let it happen. I kept moving, driven by some primal instinct that equated motion with survival. That's when I found the road. It appeared suddenly, rising out of a shallow depression like a black river flowing across the tan grassland. Asphalt, real asphalt, with yellow lines down the center and even a few scattered reflectors. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I fell to my hands and knees on the warm pavement and kissed the painted center line, tears streaming down my face. Roads meant cars, and cars meant people, and people meant rescue. I just had to follow it until I found help. I chose a direction at random and started walking. The sun was setting again, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed to pulse and writhe like living things. But I didn't care about the wrong sky or the twisted landscape anymore. I had found the way out. The road stretched ahead of me, perfectly straight and empty. No tire tracks, no oil stains, no sign that any vehicle had ever traveled this route. But it was real. It had to be real. I could feel the solid asphalt beneath my feet, could smell the familiar petroleum scent of hot pavement. I walked for what felt like hours, though the sun never seemed to move in the sky. My feet were blistered and bleeding inside my boots, and every step sent jolts of pain up my legs. But I kept moving, driven by the knowledge that this road had to lead somewhere. That's when I saw the car. It was sitting in the middle of the road maybe a quarter-mile ahead, a dark shape silhouetted against the dying light. As I got closer, I could make out more details. A dark SUV, maybe a Chevy, with South Dakota plates. The driver's door was open, and someone was sitting behind the wheel. "Help!" I called out, waving my arms despite the pain in my shoulders. "Please, I need help." The figure in the car turned toward me, and I could see it wave back. Normal. Human. The first sign of genuine rescue I'd encountered in 4 days of hell. I broke into a stumbling run, my battered feet protesting with every step. But as I got closer, details began to register that made my sprint falter to a walk. The SUV was my Subaru. The same model, the same color, even the same dent in the rear bumper from a parking lot mishap 2 years ago. But that was impossible. I'd left my car at the trailhead, 60 miles from here. The figure behind the wheel turned to face me fully, and I saw my own face looking back at me. But this version was cleaner, healthier than the haggard reflection I'd been seeing in my phone's camera. This Sarah Rodriguez looked like she'd just stepped out of a salon rather than spent 4 days dying in the wilderness. "Get in," she said, and her voice was exactly mine but somehow wrong, like an actor delivering lines she'd memorized without understanding their meaning. "I'll take you home." I backed away from the car, my heart hammering against my ribs. The not-me smiled, and there were too many teeth in that smile, all of them sharp as broken glass. "Don't you want to go home, Sarah?" it asked, tilting its head at an angle that would have snapped a human neck. "I know you're tired, I know you're thirsty. Just get in the car, and everything will be better." The passenger door swung open with a rusty squeal. Inside, I could see something that might have been Diesel sitting in the back seat, panting happily. "Look," the thing said, "I brought your dog. He missed you so much." But the thing in the back seat wasn't quite right either. Its eyes were too bright, and its tongue lolled from its mouth in a way that looked more like a leer than panting. When it spoke, its voice was a perfect mimicry of my own. "Come home, Sarah," it said. "Come home where it's safe." I turned and ran back down the road, leaving the impossible car and its occupants behind. Behind me, I could hear both versions of myself calling out in unison, their voices harmonizing in a way that made my skin crawl. "You can't run forever, Sarah," they called. "This is your home now. This is where you belong." But I did run. I ran until the road disappeared beneath my feet, and I was stumbling through open prairie again. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, and I collapsed in a heap beside a small creek I didn't remember crossing. The water was real, though. Cold and clear and definitely real. I plunged my face into it and drank deeply, not caring about parasites or contamination. Water was life, and I'd been dying of thirst for the better part of a day. Only after I'd drunk my fill did I notice the footprints in the mud beside the creek. They were human prints, made by hiking boots not unlike my own. But they were wrong, in the same way everything else in this place was wrong. Too long, with toes that spread too wide and an extra digit where no digit should be. The stride length was impossibly long, as if whatever made them had been taking 7-foot steps. The prints led along the creek bank, heading upstream toward a cluster of cottonwood trees that definitely hadn't been there an hour ago. I could see smoke rising from among the branches, could smell the familiar scent of a wood fire. My rational mind screamed warnings, but my body was beyond caring. I needed warmth, needed shelter, needed to get out of the wind that had begun to pick up as true darkness fell. The prints might belong to something inhuman, but the fire was real. I followed the creek toward the trees, moving as quietly as I could. If there was something dangerous in those woods, I wanted to see it before it saw me. The campsite was small and neat, tucked into a clearing among the cottonwoods. A fire burned in a circle of stones, tended by a figure in familiar hiking clothes. My heart leaped with relief and terror in equal measure as I recognized the person sitting by the flames. It was me again. But this version looked different from the one in the car. This Sarah Rodriguez was filthy and exhausted, with tangled hair and clothes stained with mud and sweat. She looked exactly like I must look after 4 days in hell. "Hello," she said without looking up from the fire. "I was wondering when you'd get here." I stayed hidden in the shadows at the edge of the clearing, trying to decide if this was another trap or if I'd finally lost my mind completely. "I know you're there," the other me continued, still staring into the flames. "I can smell you. 4 days without a shower will do that." She finally looked up, and I was staring into my own eyes. But these eyes were different. They held a depth of pain and exhaustion that went beyond physical suffering. These were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, understood too much. "You're wondering if I'm real," she said. "If I'm another one of their tricks. I don't blame you. I thought the same thing when I found this place." "Who are you?" I whispered. She smiled, and it was my smile, but older somehow. Wiser and sadder and infinitely more tired. "I'm you," she said simply. "From about 6 months in the future, give or take." I stepped into the clearing, my legs shaking with exhaustion and fear. Nothing made sense anymore. Time and space had become fluid things, flowing around me like water. "That's impossible," I said. "So are skinwalkers and pocket dimensions and all the other things we've seen out here," she replied. "But here we are." I collapsed beside the fire, grateful for its warmth despite my terror. The other me, my future self, handed me a canteen that appeared to be full of clean water. "Drink," she said. "You'll need your strength for what's coming." I drank greedily, then looked up at her with questions burning in my throat. "What are those things? What do they want?" "They're hunger," she said simply. "Hunger given form and will. They feed on fear and isolation and the gradual dissolution of everything that makes us human. This place, it's like a web. Once you're caught, you can't escape. You can only go deeper." "But you're here," I said. "You escaped." She shook her head sadly. "No, Sarah, I never escaped. Neither will you. This is where we live now, in the spaces between spaces, in the cracks where reality has worn thin. We're bait now, lures to draw others into the web." "I don't understand." "You will," she said, and her eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. "The things that hunt us, they're not malevolent. Not really. They're just efficient. They've learned that the best way to catch prey is to use the prey itself as bait. Think about it. Who would trust another hiker more than a lost and frightened woman who looks exactly like them?" Horror crept up my spine like ice water. "You're saying you're one of them?" "I'm saying the distinction stopped mattering a long time ago," she replied. "I was you, once. Lost and afraid and desperate to get home. But I never did get home, Sarah. Instead, I became part of this place. Part of the hunt." She reached out and touched my face with fingers that felt too cold, too sharp. "And soon you will, too." I jerked away from her touch and stumbled backward, but the clearing was no longer there. Instead, I found myself standing in absolute darkness, surrounded by whispers and voices I recognized as my own. "Don't fight it," they said in perfect unison. "It only makes it harder." Light exploded around me, and I was back at my original campsite on the first night, sitting beside my fire with Diesel at my side. But now I could see the truth of what had been watching us from the darkness. Dozens of figures stood just beyond the circle of light, all of them wearing familiar faces. Multiple versions of myself, of Diesel, of Marcus and my sister and everyone I'd ever cared about. They were all smiling. "Welcome home, Sarah," they said together, and their voices were the sound of wind through grave dirt and the last breath leaving dying lungs. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Tried to scream, but no sound emerged. I could only watch as they stepped into the light, their features shifting and flowing like melting wax. The version of Diesel sitting beside me turned its head and spoke in my voice. "Isn't this nice? We're all together now, forever and ever and ever." I woke up screaming, but I wasn't in the clearing anymore. I was lying on concrete, cold and hard beneath my back. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and somewhere nearby I could hear the sound of voices, real human voices speaking in concerned tones. "She's coming around," someone said. A woman, middle-aged, with kind eyes and a hospital ID badge clipped to her scrubs. "How are you feeling, honey?" I tried to sit up, but gentle hands pressed me back down. My throat was raw, my lips cracked and bleeding. Every muscle in my body ached as if I'd been running for days. "Where?" I croaked. "You're in the emergency room at Rapid City Regional," the nurse said. "A park ranger found you collapsed on the trail about 6 hours ago. You were severely dehydrated and hypothermic. Do you remember what happened?" Memories flooded back in a rush that made my head spin. The bad lands, the voices in the dark, the things that wore my face. But looking around the sterile hospital room, with its normal fluorescent lights and normal human voices, it all seemed like a nightmare. "How long was I out there?" I asked. The nurse checked her chart. According to the ranger, you'd been missing for about 18 hours. Your car was found at the Sage Creek trailhead yesterday morning. We've been searching since then. 18 hours, not 4 days. The sun that had moved wrong in the sky, the stars in impossible configurations, the endless wandering through a landscape that shifted like a living thing, all of it had happened in less than a day. "My dog," I said suddenly, struggling to sit up despite the IV line in my arm. "I had my dog with me. Is he—" "No dog was found with you," the nurse said gently. "Are you sure you brought him? Sometimes when people are in distress they can have very vivid hallucinations. But I knew Diesel had been real. I could still feel the warmth of his fur, could still hear his bark echoing across the twisted landscape of my nightmare. Whatever had happened to me out there, whatever pocket of unreality I'd stumbled into, he was still trapped inside it. The nurse gave me a sedative, and I slept for 12 hours. When I woke, the doctors had ruled out any serious physical injury. Dehydration, exhaustion, and what they politely called acute stress reaction. They wanted to keep me for observation, but I signed myself out against medical advice. I needed to go home, needed to think, needed to figure out what had really happened in those missing hours. My sister picked me up from the hospital and drove me back to my apartment in Rapid City. She fussed over me, brought me soup and tea and magazines, but I could see the worry in her eyes, the questions she wanted to ask but didn't dare. "Maybe you should talk to someone," she said finally. "A therapist, I mean. What you went through, it's traumatic, even if you can't remember all of it. But I did remember. Every impossible moment, every twisted reflection of reality, every voice that had called my name in the darkness. The problem was that none of it made sense in the bright, rational world of hospital rooms and insurance forms and well-meaning relatives. I told her I'd think about it, and she left me alone with my thoughts. That was 3 months ago. I've been to therapists since then, tried different medications, even did a brief stint in an inpatient program when the nightmares got too bad. Everyone has theories. PTSD, dissociative episodes, some kind of break brought on by the stress of my divorce. But I know the truth. I know what I saw out there in the spaces between spaces. And I know that Diesel is still trapped in that place, waiting for me to come back for him. The worst part is the dreams. Not the nightmares of twisted faces and impossible geographies, but the normal dreams. The ones where I'm back in my apartment and Diesel comes padding out of the bedroom, tail wagging, ready for his morning walk. In those dreams, everything is exactly as it was before that terrible day in the Badlands. It's only when I wake up that I remember the truth. I've been back to the trailhead twice since the incident. Both times I found excuses to turn around before reaching the actual wilderness. Equipment failures, sudden storms, mysterious car trouble. My subconscious is protecting me, I think, keeping me away from a place that exists outside the normal flow of reality. But I can't stop thinking about him. My loyal companion, trapped in a maze of mirrors and echoes, calling my name in a voice that sounds like my own. The therapists tell me that survivor's guilt is normal, that my mind created an elaborate fantasy to cope with losing him. They say acceptance is the first step toward healing. They don't understand that some things shouldn't be accepted, some losses shouldn't be mourned, some companions shouldn't be abandoned. I'm writing this down because I've decided to go back. Not to the same trailhead. I'm not ready for that yet, but to another entrance to the Badlands, one farther south where the land is wilder and the rangers patrol less frequently. I've been researching local folklore, collecting stories about time slips and pocket dimensions and places where the rules don't apply. There are others who've had similar experiences. People who speak in whispers about the thin places, the borderlands where our world touches something else. Most of them never talk about it openly, but they recognize each other somehow. We have a look, they say. The look of people who've seen behind the curtain and can never quite forget what's waiting there. I found a blog post from a woman in Montana who swears she lived through an entire year in a place that couldn't exist, only to wake up after 3 hours of missing time. She talks about the hunger that lives in those spaces, the way it wears familiar faces to draw us deeper into its web. But she also talks about the doors, the way out, for those brave enough or foolish enough to find them. I think I know where one of those doors is. I think I know how to reach the place where my dog is waiting. It might be a trap, probably is a trap, but I can't live with the knowledge that I abandoned him to save myself. Tomorrow, I'm driving to the Buffalo Gap National Grassland. There's a trailhead there that doesn't appear on any official maps, one that the locals avoid without being able to say why. I've been having dreams about it, the same kinds of dreams that led me to the Badlands in the first place. If I don't come back, if they find my car empty at another trailhead, maybe someone will read this and understand. Maybe they'll learn from my mistakes. Or maybe they'll make the same choice I did. Maybe they'll decide that some bonds are stronger than survival, that love is worth the risk of becoming something other than human. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 29 years old. Tomorrow I'm going to find my dog, even if it kills me, even if it doesn't. My name is David Jones, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Black Hills of South Dakota, 3 miles northeast of Harney Peak, in a stretch of wilderness that doesn't appear on any current maps. I should have listened to Marcus when he said we shouldn't have come here. I should have paid attention to the way Sarah kept checking her phone, how her laugh had gotten too sharp, too quick, but I was so desperate to get away from everything. The divorce papers, the empty apartment, the job I'd lost 2 weeks prior, that I would have followed them into hell itself. As it turned out, that's exactly what I did. We'd been planning this backpacking trip for months back when my life still made sense. Marcus Chen, my roommate from college, had found this remote section of the Black Hills through some obscure hiking forum. Untouched Wilderness, he'd called it, showing us grainy photos of dense pine forests and rocky outcroppings. No cell towers, no trails, no people, just us and nature for 5 days. Sarah Kovach, my coworker from the marketing firm before they laid me off, had been immediately interested. She was going through her own rough patch, a messy breakup with her fiancé of 3 years, and the idea of disappearing into the wilderness appealed to all of us for different reasons. The drive up from Rapid City had taken longer than expected. My GPS had started glitching about 40 miles out, the screen flickering between route calculations and error messages. Marcus's phone showed we were driving through empty space, no roads marked at all. Sarah had printed backup directions from some outdated website, but the paper had gotten coffee-stained and smudged until the text was barely readable. "Maybe we should turn back," Sarah had said as we bounced along an increasingly rough dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere. The afternoon sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows between the towering ponderosa pines. "We're almost there," Marcus insisted, though he'd been saying that for the past hour. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel of his beaten-up Subaru. "The trailhead should be just ahead." That's when we saw the sign. It was weathered and tilted, barely hanging onto a rotted fence post. Most of the paint had peeled away, but I could still make out the words, "Private property, no trespassing, danger." Below that, in smaller, newer letters that someone had carved into the wood with what looked like a knife. "They come out at night." "Probably just local kids trying to scare people," Marcus said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. Sarah leaned forward from the back seat, her dark hair falling across her face. "David, what do you think?" I should have said we should leave. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to tell Marcus to turn the car around and drive back to civilization. But I was 29 years old, recently divorced, unemployed, and desperate to prove to myself that I could still handle something, anything, without falling apart. "We've come this far," I said. "Besides, it's probably just referring to bears or mountain lions." The trailhead, when we finally found it, was nothing more than a gap between 2 massive pine trees marked by a cairn of stacked stones. Someone had spray-painted a small red X on one of the trees, but the paint was so faded it was barely visible. We shouldered our packs in the dying light. Mine felt heavier than it had during our practice hikes back home, the weight pressing down on my shoulders like a physical manifestation of dread. The forest around us was unnaturally quiet. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just the soft whisper of wind through pine needles. "How far to the first campsite?" Sarah asked, adjusting her pack straps. She was trying to sound casual, but I could hear the tension in her voice. Marcus consulted his printed map, though the fading light made it difficult to read. "About 3 miles. We should reach it before full dark." We didn't. The path, if it could even be called that, twisted and turned through increasingly dense forest. What had looked like a clear trail on Marcus's map turned out to be little more than animal tracks and the occasional broken branch. Every few hundred yards we'd come to a fork or a clearing where the path seemed to vanish entirely, forcing us to stop and argue about which direction to go. The worst part was the way the forest seemed to close in around us as darkness fell. The pine trees grew so thick overhead that even the minimal moonlight couldn't penetrate the canopy. We had to rely on our flashlights, their narrow beams creating dancing circles of visibility in an ocean of impenetrable black. "This doesn't feel right," Sarah said during one of our rest stops. We'd been hiking for over 4 hours, far longer than it should have taken to cover 3 miles. "It's like we're walking in circles." Marcus was studying his map again, rotating it this way and that as if it might suddenly make sense. "The terrain is just more complicated than it looked. We'll find the campsite soon." But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. In the harsh LED light of our flashlights, his face looked pale and drawn. We were lost, and we all knew it. "Maybe we should just camp here," I suggested, gesturing to a small clearing where the trees opened up enough to accommodate our tents. "We can figure out where we are in the morning." "No," Marcus said quickly, too quickly. "The campsite has a water source. We'll need it." That's when we heard the sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind in the pines. A low, mournful cry that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It rose and fell like a siren, but there was something distinctly organic about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Coyote," Sarah whispered. I'd heard plenty of coyotes during my childhood camping trips with my father. This wasn't a coyote. This was something else entirely, something that made every primitive instinct in my brain scream warnings. The sound came again, closer this time, and with it came a smell, sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water. It made my stomach turn. "We need to move," Marcus said, and for once I agreed with him completely. We pushed deeper into the forest, our flashlight beams dancing wildly as we stumbled over roots and fallen logs. The crying sound followed us, sometimes close enough that I was sure whatever was making it was just beyond the reach of our lights, sometimes so distant it might have been my imagination. It was Sarah who found the campsite, though "found" might not be the right word. She simply stopped walking and pointed her flashlight ahead. "There," she said. "Look." In the pale circle of her light, I could see a small clearing ringed by standing stones. Not natural stones. These had been carefully placed, each one about waist-high and carved with symbols I didn't recognize. In the center of the circle was a fire pit made from blackened rocks, and around it, the remains of what might once have been a campsite. "This isn't on the map," Marcus said, but his voice sounded strange, distant. As we approached the stone circle, our flashlights revealed more details that made my skin crawl. The symbols carved into the stones weren't random. They formed patterns, interconnected designs that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. The ground inside the circle was bare earth, packed hard as concrete with no grass or vegetation of any kind. Most disturbing of all were the offerings. They were scattered around the base of each stone, small animal bones picked clean, bundles of feathers tied with what looked like human hair, and dozens of objects I couldn't identify. Some looked like twisted metal, others like carved wood, all of them arranged with an intentionality that spoke of ritual, of worship. "We should go," Sarah said, Find somewhere else to camp." But Marcus was already dropping his pack inside the circle. "It's late," he said. "We're exhausted. This is as good a place as any." "Marcus, look around," I said. "This is clearly some kind of sacred site. We shouldn't be here." He turned to face me, and in the stark white light of my flashlight, his expression looked wrong somehow. His eyes were too bright, his smile too wide. "Come on, David. Don't tell me you're getting superstitious on us." That's when I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. Marcus's shadow, cast by my flashlight against the trees behind him, didn't match his movements. While he stood facing me with his arms at his sides, his shadow appeared to be reaching toward the stones, fingers stretched wide as if grasping for something. I blinked hard, certain I was imagining things, but when I looked again, the shadow was normal. Marcus was already setting up his tent, acting as if nothing had happened. "Fine," I said, though every fiber of my being was telling me to run. "But we leave first thing in the morning." Setting up camp inside the stone circle felt like a violation, like we were intruding on something ancient and important. The packed earth was so hard it took all three of us working together to drive in the tent stakes. As we worked, I became aware of a sound just at the edge of hearing, a low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to come from the ground beneath our feet. "Do you hear that?" I asked Sarah as we struggled with her tent. She paused, her head cocked to one side. "Hear what?" "That humming sound." She listened for a moment, then shook her head. "I don't hear anything." But I did. It was like standing next to a massive generator, feeling the vibration in my bones even when I couldn't quite hear the sound itself. It made my teeth ache. We managed to get a small fire going in the existing pit, though the flames burned strangely, sometimes normal orange and yellow, other times flickering blue and green like a gas burner. Marcus noticed it too, poking at the logs with a stick and frowning. "Probably mineral deposits in the wood," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. We ate our freeze-dried meals in relative silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The forest around us remained unnaturally quiet. No owls, no nocturnal insects, nothing but the constant whisper of wind through the pines and that subsonic thrumming that only I seemed able to hear. "So," Sarah said, clearly trying to lighten the mood, "remind me why we thought this was a good idea?" "Because we're all running away from something," I said before I could stop myself. The words hung in the air between us, too honest for the casual conversation we'd been trying to maintain. Sarah stared into the fire, her face unreadable in the dancing light. "What are you running from, David?" Marcus asked. His voice was still wrong, too interested, too intent. "You know what I'm running from," I said. "The divorce, the job, everything falling apart." "And what about you, Sarah?" Marcus pressed. "What are you running from?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm running from the person I was becoming, the person he wanted me to be." "And what person was that?" "Someone small," she said. "Someone who apologized for taking up space." I wanted to reach out to her, to offer some kind of comfort, but something in Marcus's expression stopped me. He was watching Sarah with a predatory intensity that made my stomach turn. "And what about you, Marcus?" I asked. "What are you running from?" His smile widened, and in the firelight his teeth looked too sharp. "Who says I'm running from anything? Maybe I'm running toward something instead." That's when the crying started again. This time it was unmistakably close, somewhere just beyond the ring of stones. But it wasn't the animal sound we'd heard before. This was distinctly human. A child's voice, high and desperate, calling out in the darkness. "Help me," the voice sobbed. "Please, someone help me." Sarah was on her feet immediately, grabbing her flashlight. "There's someone out there." "Sarah, wait," I said, but she was already moving toward the edge of the circle. "Hello?" she called out. "Where are you? Are you hurt?" The crying continued, but it seemed to move as Sarah approached the stones, always staying just beyond the reach of her flashlight beam. She followed it around the perimeter of the circle, her light sweeping back and forth through the trees. "I can't see anything," she said, frustration creeping into her voice, "but I can hear them clear as day." Marcus hadn't moved from his spot by the fire. He sat watching Sarah with that same unsettling smile as if he were enjoying some private joke. "Marcus," I hissed, "help me talk sense into her." He turned that smile on me, and I saw that his pupils had dilated until his eyes were almost completely black. "Why would I do that? This is the most interesting thing that's happened all day." The child's crying grew more desperate, more heartbreaking. It pulled at something deep in my chest, a primal urge to help, to protect. Even knowing it was wrong, even knowing we should stay in the circle, I found myself getting to my feet. "Please," the voice called. "I'm lost. I can't find my mommy." "We have to do something," Sarah said, and she stepped outside the circle. The moment her foot crossed the boundary marked by the stones, everything changed. The crying stopped instantly, cut off as if someone had flipped a switch. The fire behind us flared blue-white, then died to barely glowing embers. And the thrumming sound I'd been hearing all evening suddenly became audible to all of us. A deep, rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Sarah," I called, but my voice sounded strange, muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. "Come back." She turned toward me, her flashlight beam sweeping across my face, and I saw that her expression had gone completely blank. Her eyes were wide and staring, but there was no recognition in them, no awareness. "Sarah?" She opened her mouth as if to speak, but instead of words, that same childlike crying came out. It was her voice, but distorted, wrong, like a recording played at the wrong speed. I lunged forward to grab her, but Marcus caught my arm with inhuman strength. His fingers dug into my bicep hard enough to bruise. "Let her go," he said, and his voice had changed too. It was deeper now, resonant, with harmonics that made my bones ache. "She's found what she was looking for." Sarah stood just outside the circle for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, crying that terrible child's cry while staring at nothing. Then, as suddenly as it had started, she stopped. Her expression cleared and she looked around as if seeing her surroundings for the first time. "What happened?" she asked. "Why am I outside the circle?" I pulled free from Marcus's grip and helped her back across the boundary. The moment she was inside the ring of stones again, the thrumming stopped and the fire flared back to life. "You heard a child crying," I said. "You went to look for them." She frowned, touching her forehead as if it hurt. "I don't remember that. I remember sitting by the fire and then nothing." Marcus was still smiling. "Memory plays tricks in places like this. The old stories say these forests can show you things, make you hear things that aren't really there." "What old stories?" I demanded. "Native American legends, mostly. The Lakota have dozens of stories about these hills, spirits that steal voices, creatures that wear human faces, places where the boundary between worlds grows thin." I stared at him. "And you didn't think to mention this before we came here?" His smile widened. "Where would be the fun in that?" The rest of the night passed in a haze of exhaustion and creeping dread. We took turns keeping watch, though what we were watching for, none of us could say. During my shift, I heard sounds moving through the forest, footsteps that didn't quite match human gait, voices calling to each other in languages I didn't recognize, and underneath it all, that persistent thrumming that seemed to come from the earth itself. When Sarah took over the watch at 3 a.m., I crawled into my tent gratefully, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcus's shadow reaching for the stones, heard Sarah making that terrible crying sound. The temperature had dropped significantly, and my breath formed clouds in the frigid air, but the packed earth beneath my sleeping bag felt warm, almost hot. I must have dozed off eventually, because I was awakened by Sarah screaming. I shot upright, adrenaline flooding my system, and fumbled for my flashlight. Outside my tent, Sarah was sobbing hysterically. "They took him," she gasped as I emerged. They took Marcus." In the pale dawn light filtering through the pine canopy, I could see Marcus's tent. It was still zipped shut, but it had collapsed inward as if whatever had been supporting it had simply vanished. Sarah stood next to it, her face streaked with tears, pointing at something I couldn't see. "What do you mean they took him?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "I was watching the tree line," she said, "just like we agreed. Marcus was in his tent. I could hear him moving around, shifting in his sleeping bag. Then the tent just collapsed. I unzipped it and he wasn't there." I approached Marcus's tent cautiously, my flashlight beam dancing in the growing daylight. The zipper was still closed from the inside, but when I pulled it open, the tent was empty. His sleeping bag was there, still warm, but there was no sign of Marcus himself. "Maybe he went to relieve himself," I suggested, though even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. "David, look at the ground." I followed her pointing finger and felt my blood turn to ice. The packed earth around Marcus's tent was undisturbed. No footprints, no sign that anyone had walked in or out of the area. But underneath the tent, pressed into the hard ground as if stamped there by enormous weight, was a pattern I recognized from the stones. The same symbols, the same interconnected designs, branded into the earth in perfect detail. "We need to find him," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. I was already breaking down my tent, shoving gear into my pack with shaking hands. "We need to leave, now. We can't just abandon him." "Sarah, look around." I gestured at the stone circle, at the symbols burned into the ground, at the forest that seemed to press in closer in the growing light. "This place isn't natural. Something happened to Marcus, something we can't fight or understand. Our only chance is to get out of here and bring back help." She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the collapsed tent. Finally, she nodded and began packing her own gear. It took us 2 hours to break camp and another hour to find our way out of the stone circle. The forest that had seemed merely confusing the night before now felt actively hostile. Paths we'd taken to reach the campsite had vanished entirely. Trees that I was certain had been on our right the day before were now on our left. Our compasses spun wildly, never settling on a consistent direction. Worse yet, we could hear Marcus calling to us. His voice came from all directions, sometimes close enough that we'd catch glimpses of movement through the trees, sometimes so distant it might have been the wind. But it was definitely Marcus, calling our names, asking us to wait for him. "Marcus," Sarah called back during one of these episodes, but I grabbed her arm. "Don't answer," I said. "Listen to his voice." She cocked her head, concentrating. After a moment, her face went pale. "He's not breathing between words." She was right. The voice that sounded like Marcus spoke in long, continuous sentences without any pause for breath. It rose and fell with perfect clarity, carrying impossible distances through the dense forest. But there was no breathing, no human rhythm to it. "Where are you going?" the Marcus voice called from somewhere ahead of us. "Don't you want to find me?" We changed direction, pushing deeper into a section of forest so thick we had to fight our way through branches that seemed to grab at our clothing and equipment. The pine needles overhead grew so dense that even though it was now mid-morning, we moved in a green twilight that made it impossible to tell direction or time. "I'm hurt," the voice said, much closer now. "Please, I need help." Sarah started toward the sound, but I held her back. Through a gap in the trees, I could see a figure standing about 50 yards away. It looked like Marcus, same height, same build, same red jacket. But something about its posture was wrong. It stood too straight, too still, like a department store mannequin. "Marcus," I called, "is that you?" The figure turned toward us, and even at that distance I could see that while it had Marcus's face, it was wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. The features were too symmetrical, too perfect, like a photograph that had been subtly manipulated. "Of course it's me," it said, and its voice was Marcus's voice exactly, but it carried through the trees without any reduction in volume or clarity, as if the speaker were standing right next to us. Why won't you come help me?" The thing that looked like Marcus began walking toward us, and that's when I saw what was really wrong with it. Its movements were too fluid, too graceful. It didn't step over fallen logs or duck under low branches. It simply glided forward as if the obstacles weren't there. "Run," I whispered to Sarah. We crashed through the underbrush, our packs catching on branches, our boots slipping on loose pine needles. Behind us, the Marcus thing followed, calling out in that perfectly clear voice. "Why are you running from me? I thought we were friends." The words followed us even as we put distance between ourselves and the figure. They seemed to come from the trees themselves, from the air around us, inescapable. We ran for what felt like hours, though the unchanging twilight under the canopy made it impossible to judge time. My lungs burned, my legs ached, and my pack felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Just as I thought I couldn't go any further, we burst out of the tree line into bright sunshine. We were standing on a rocky outcropping that overlooked a vast expanse of forested hills. In the distance, I could see what looked like a road winding through the valley below. Civilization. Escape. Sarah collapsed next to me, gasping for breath. "Thank God," she panted. "I thought we'd never get out of there." But as I looked back at the forest we'd just emerged from, my relief evaporated. The tree line was wrong. We'd been hiking steadily uphill for the past hour, but the forest behind us stretched away downhill, as if we'd somehow emerged from the bottom of a valley rather than the top. "Sarah," I said slowly, "look at the sun." She raised her head, shading her eyes against the bright light. "What about it?" "It's setting." She stared at the sun, which was clearly sinking toward the western horizon. "That's impossible. It was morning when we left the campsite. I checked my watch, but the digital display showed only flashing characters, 12, 88, and 77. Sarah's watch was no better, showing a time of 25.91. "How long were we in there?" she whispered. Before I could answer, we heard Marcus's voice again, coming from the forest behind us. "David? Sarah? Where did you go?" This time the voice sounded normal, confused, concerned, entirely human. We both turned to see Marcus emerge from the tree line about 100 yards away. He looked exactly as he had the day before, wearing the same clothes, carrying the same pack, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a depth that seemed to go on forever. "Thank God," Sarah said, getting to her feet. "Marcus, we've been looking everywhere for you." Marcus smiled, and his teeth were too white, too sharp. "I've been looking for you too." He began walking toward us, and I noticed that he cast no shadow despite the bright sunlight. The rocky ground beneath his feet showed no footprints, no disturbance of any kind. "Where have you been?" Sarah asked, oblivious to what I was seeing. "I've been in the forest," Marcus said, "waiting for you to come back for me." His voice was perfect. Exactly the right inflection, exactly the right emotional tone. But underneath it, I could hear something else, a harmonic resonance that made my teeth ache. "Sarah," I said quietly, "we need to go." But she was already walking toward Marcus, relief evident on her face. "I'm so glad you're okay. We heard you calling, but we couldn't find you." "I know," Marcus said. "I heard you calling, too." That's when I noticed the smell, sweet and cloying like flowers left too long in water. The same smell we'd encountered our first night in the forest. "Sarah, stop," I said, more urgently this time. She turned back to me, confusion on her face. "David, what's wrong? It's Marcus." "No," I said, backing away from both of them. "It's not." The thing that looked like Marcus tilted its head, studying me with those two deep eyes. "Of course I'm Marcus. Who else would I be?" "Prove it," I said. "Tell me something only Marcus would know." It smiled wider, and I saw that its canine teeth were too long, too sharp. "I know you're afraid, David. I know you've been afraid your whole life. Afraid of being alone, afraid of failing, afraid of becoming the disappointment your father always said you were." The words hit me like physical blows. These were things I'd never told anyone, private fears I'd barely admitted to myself. "I know Sarah dreams about drowning," it continued, its gaze shifting to her. "Every night since she was 7, when her brother fell through the ice. She dreams about the water closing over her head, about being trapped underneath, unable to breathe." Sarah's face had gone white. "How do you know that? I never told anyone." "And I know about the cabin," the Marcus thing said, turning back to me. "The one your family had when you were a kid. The one where your uncle—" "Stop," I said, my voice cracking. "Just stop." But it continued, each word perfectly chosen to inflict maximum psychological damage. It knew things about us that no one should know, secrets we'd buried so deep we'd almost forgotten them ourselves. As it spoke, I became aware that the sun was moving too fast across the sky, racing toward the horizon at an impossible rate. The shadows around us lengthened and shifted, and in those shadows I saw shapes moving, tall, thin figures that flickered at the edge of vision. "We need to leave," I said to Sarah. "Right now." But when I turned to her, she wasn't there. The rocky outcropping where she'd been standing was empty, showing no sign that anyone had ever been there. "Looking for someone?" the Marcus thing asked. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. Sarah was standing next to it, her face blank and expressionless, her eyes the same impossible depth as its own. "She's with us now," the thing said. "Just like Marcus is with us. Just like you will be." Sarah opened her mouth, and when she spoke, her voice had the same harmonic resonance, the same inhuman perfection. "Why are you fighting this, David? It doesn't hurt. You just let go." The sun touched the horizon, and darkness began to spread across the landscape like spilled ink. In that darkness, more shapes appeared, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all moving toward me with that same fluid, impossible grace. I ran. I ran down the rocky slope, slipping and sliding on loose stone, my pack bouncing against my back. Behind me, I could hear them following. Not just the Marcus thing and the thing that had been Sarah, but all of them. A chorus of voices calling my name. The road I'd seen from the outcropping turned out to be nothing more than a dry creek bed, but I followed it anyway, hoping it would lead to genuine civilization. The darkness was absolute now, but I didn't dare use my flashlight for fear of attracting their attention. I ran through the night, stumbling over rocks and fallen logs, driven by pure terror. The voices followed me for hours, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always there. They called to me in the voices of everyone I'd ever known, my parents, my ex-wife, childhood friends, co-workers. They knew exactly what to say to make me want to stop, to turn around, to give up. But I kept running. Dawn found me collapsed beside a real road, a 2-lane blacktop that showed actual tire tracks and yellow-painted lines. I flagged down the first vehicle I saw, a pickup truck driven by a local rancher who took one look at my condition and immediately called 911. The search and rescue teams found our campsite 3 days later, guided by my increasingly frantic descriptions. But when they reached the coordinates I'd given them, there was nothing there. No stone circle, no carved symbols, no sign that anyone had ever camped in that location. The area was marked on their maps as impassable terrain, a steep ravine filled with deadfall and brambles. They found Marcus's and Sarah's cars in the trailhead parking area, but no trace of them. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead due to exposure or accident. The case remains open, but I know the searchers will never find them, because they're not missing. They're still there, in whatever place exists beyond the stone circle, waiting for the next group of lost travelers to find their way into the whispering darkness. I tried to move on, tried to rebuild my life. I found a new job, a new apartment, even started dating again. But the memories wouldn't fade. Every night, I heard their voices calling to me. Every shadow seemed to hide familiar faces. Every forest looked like the place I'd lost my friends. The worst part was the dreams. In them, I was back in the stone circle, and Marcus and Sarah were there, their faces perfect and terrible, asking me why I'd left them behind. And in the dreams, I could never remember why running had seemed so important. It's been 6 months now since the Black Hills. I've moved 3 times, changed my phone number twice, and started seeing a therapist who thinks I'm suffering from survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress. Maybe he's right. Maybe none of it happened the way I remember. Maybe Marcus and Sarah really did just wander off and die of exposure, and everything else is just my mind's way of coping with the guilt. But last week, I received a package in the mail. No return address, no postmark I could read. Inside was a photograph of the stone circle, taken from exactly the angle where my tent had been pitched. In the center of the circle, 2 figures stood with their backs to the camera. They were too far away to make out clearly, but I recognized the silhouettes immediately. They were waiting for me to come back. And God help me, I'm starting to think I will. The pull grows stronger every day, a constant ache in my chest, a voice in the back of my mind whispering that I left something important behind in those dark woods. The rational part of my brain knows it's madness, but the rational part is getting smaller and quieter with each passing day. I've started packing a bag, just a small one, with the essentials. I tell myself it's just in case, that I'll never actually use it. But I catch myself checking the contents every night, making sure everything is ready. They're calling to me now, even here in my apartment 2 states away. I can hear their voices in the wind outside my window, see their faces in every crowd. They want me to come home. And I think I'm finally ready to listen. My name is David Jones, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Black Hills of South Dakota, 3 miles northeast of Harney Peak, in a stretch of wilderness that doesn't appear on any current maps. And tomorrow, I'm going back. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Black Hills of South Dakota, 3 miles northeast of Deadwood, where the pine trees grow so thick they block out the sun even at midday. I should have known something was wrong when Rex stopped barking. My German Shepherd had been my constant companion for 4 years, ever since I'd adopted him from the shelter in Denver. He barked at everything, squirrels, mailmen, his own reflection. But as we hiked deeper into the Spearfish Canyon Trail that October morning, his usual enthusiasm had drained away like water through cupped hands. The plan was simple: a 3-day solo backpacking trip to clear my head after the divorce. Marcus had taken everything else, the house, most of our friends, even my confidence, but he couldn't take the mountains from me. I'd grown up hiking with my father before cancer claimed him, and these wilderness trails were the only place I still felt like myself. Rex trotted beside me, his black and tan coat dappled with early morning shadows. The temperature was perfect, crisp enough to keep the bugs away but warm enough that I'd already shed my jacket. My GPS showed we were making good time toward the backcountry campsite I'd reserved, a remote spot called Crow's Nest that promised solitude and pristine views. But the GPS was wrong. I first noticed the discrepancy around noon, when the trail should have started its steep ascent toward the ridge. Instead, we were walking through a dense grove of ponderosa pines that didn't match the topographical map at all. I stopped and pulled out my phone, frowning at the screen. The little blue dot that represented our location was floating in what appeared to be empty space, miles from any marked trail. "That's weird," I muttered, shaking the device. Rex sat beside me, panting lightly. When I looked down at him, something cold slithered through my stomach. His ears weren't pricked forward like usual. They hung slack against his head, and his dark eyes seemed unfocused. I knelt and scratched behind his ears. "You okay, boy?" He didn't lean into my touch the way he always did. Instead, he turned his head slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. The forest around us was unusually quiet. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, no scurrying of small animals through the underbrush. Even the wind had died. I tried refreshing the GPS signal, but the blue dot continued its aimless drift across the screen. My compass spun lazily before settling on what I was pretty sure was the wrong direction. The sun, which should have been almost directly overhead, seemed to be setting early behind the western trees, casting long shadows that made the temperature drop 10 degrees in a matter of minutes. "Come on, Rex, let's keep moving." We pushed forward, following what I hoped was still the trail, though the path had become increasingly overgrown. Branches caught at my pack, and spider webs stretched across the narrow gap between trees like nature's own barricades. Rex moved mechanically beside me, no longer ranging ahead to investigate interesting scents or sounds. The first time I heard the breathing, I thought it was my own. I'd stopped to drink water and adjust my pack straps when I became aware of a rhythmic huffing sound, like someone trying to catch their breath after a long run. But I'd been walking at a leisurely pace, and my own breathing was steady and controlled. I held my breath and listened. The sound continued. A wet, labored wheeze that seemed to come from the trees themselves. Rex's head snapped up, ears finally alert. He stared into the dense forest to our left, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Relief flooded through me. Whatever was wrong with him seemed to be passing. "What is it, boy? You hear something?" The breathing stopped abruptly, as if whatever was making the sound had heard me speak. The silence that followed was so complete it made my ears ring. Rex's growl faded to a whimper, and he pressed against my legs, trembling. I'd never seen him scared before. Rex was the kind of dog who would charge a bear if he thought it was threatening me. Seeing him cower made something primal twist in my gut. "It's okay," I whispered, though I wasn't sure it was. We kept walking. The trail, if it was still a trail, began to slope downward into a narrow valley I didn't remember from the map. The trees grew even thicker here, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy so dense it felt like walking through a tunnel. My headlamp, though it was still technically afternoon, provided the only real light. That's when I noticed my pack felt lighter. I shrugged it off and opened the main compartment. My water bottles were there, but my food, 3 days' worth of carefully planned meals, was gone. In its place was something that made my stomach clench. A thick, sweet smell rose from the bag, like fruit left too long in the sun. When I reached inside, my fingers came away sticky with a dark substance I couldn't identify. The smell was enough to make me gag. I dumped the entire contents of my pack onto the ground. Everything was there except the food, but it was all wrong. My sleeping bag had been slashed open from the inside, goose-down feathers scattered like snow. My first aid kit was intact, but when I opened it, all the bandages were stained with something that looked disturbingly like blood. My camp stove was crushed as if stepped on by something with enormous weight. Rex sniffed at the destroyed gear, then backed away with another whimper. "What the hell?" I was talking to myself now, trying to process what I was seeing. How could this happen? I've had the pack on my back the entire time. But even as I said it, I realized I couldn't actually remember the last time I'd felt the weight of it properly. When had it gotten lighter? Had I been hiking for hours with destroyed gear without noticing? I tried to remember stopping to rest, adjusting the straps, feeling the familiar pull of the loaded pack. The memories felt slippery, like trying to hold water. Had we been walking for an hour? 3 hours? The sun was definitely setting now, painting the valley in shades of red and orange that made everything look like it was on fire. I repacked what was salvageable and tried my phone again. No signal, which wasn't surprising in the canyon, but the battery was nearly dead despite being fully charged that morning. The GPS app was still open, but the map was blank except for the blue dot, which now pulsed slowly like a digital heartbeat. "We need to find the campsite," I told Rex, "or at least some water." He looked at me with those unfocused eyes and wagged his tail once, a slow, deliberate movement that seemed almost calculated. The sound of running water reached us just as full darkness fell. I followed it by headlamp to a narrow creek that cut through the valley floor. The water was clear and cold, and I filled my bottles gratefully. Rex lapped at the stream's edge, but something about the way he drank, too neat, too controlled, made me uneasy. I'd never paid attention to how a dog drinks water before, but this seemed wrong. Rex wasn't splashing or slurping the way he usually did. He barely seemed to be drinking at all, just going through the motions. There was enough flat ground near the creek for my tent, so I started setting up camp. Without my sleeping bag, the night was going to be miserable, but I had a wool blanket and my spare clothes. I could survive until morning. As I worked, I became aware that Rex had stopped drinking. When I looked over, he was sitting perfectly still about 10 feet away, staring at me. Not in the loving, attentive way dogs usually watch their owners, but with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Rex," I called softly. "Come here, boy." He didn't move, didn't even blink. In the harsh white light of my headlamp, his dark eyes reflected back like chips of obsidian. I finished setting up the tent in uncomfortable silence, hyper-aware of his unblinking gaze. When I tried to coax him inside, he backed away. "Fine," I muttered. "Sleep outside if you want, but stay close." I zipped myself into the tent and tried to settle down on the hard ground. Without the insulation of my destroyed sleeping bag, the cold seeped through the tent floor immediately. I wrapped myself in the wool blanket and tried to stop shivering. Outside, I could hear Rex moving around. His footsteps were different than usual. Too precise, too rhythmic. Instead of the irregular patting and scratching of a dog settling down for the night, it sounded almost like he was pacing. Back and forth, in a perfect pattern. I must have dozed fitfully because I woke to silence. The digital clock on my phone read 3:17 a.m. The pacing had stopped. I lay still, listening for Rex's breathing or the small sounds he made when he slept. But there was nothing. "Rex?" I whispered. No response. I unzipped the tent fly a few inches and peered out. My headlamp beam swept across the small clearing, but Rex was nowhere to be seen. Panic shot through me like electricity. Rex never wandered off. Never. He was the kind of dog who would wait by the bathroom door when I showered, afraid I might disappear without him. I crawled out of the tent and stood up, sweeping my light in wider arcs. "Rex! Here, boy! Rex!" My voice echoed off the canyon walls and died. The silence that followed felt oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I spent the next hour searching, calling his name until my throat was raw. I followed the creek in both directions, checked behind every large tree and boulder. Nothing. It was as if he'd simply vanished. When I finally returned to camp, exhausted and fighting tears, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water. There were no paw prints around my tent. None. The soft dirt by the creek bank showed my boot prints clearly, but there was no sign that a large dog had ever been there. I knelt by the water's edge where I'd seen Rex drinking and shined my light on the mud. My own footprints were there, clear as day, but Rex's tracks simply weren't. How was that possible? I'd watched him drink from this exact spot just hours earlier, unless I hadn't. The thought crept into my mind like poisonous ivy. What if I'd imagined Rex's presence all evening? What if the stress of the divorce, the loneliness, the strange events of the day had caused some kind of breakdown? But no, that was impossible. Rex had been with me when we started the hike. I had clear memories of him in the car during the drive to the trailhead, of clipping his leash, of the ranger checking my permits. Those memories were solid, real. I crawled back into the tent and tried to think rationally. Maybe Rex had wandered off to hunt. Maybe he'd found some scent trail that was too interesting to resist. Dogs got distracted. It happened. But Rex had never done anything like that before. And the missing paw prints. I was still trying to make sense of it when I heard him bark. The sound came from somewhere upstream, maybe a quarter-mile away. It was definitely Rex's bark. I'd know it anywhere. Relief flooded through me so powerfully that I started crying. "Rex!" I shouted. "Stay there! I'm coming!" I grabbed my headlamp and stumbled out of the tent. The bark came again, definitely upstream, and I started running toward it, splashing through the shallow creek. "Rex! Good boy! Keep barking so I can find you." But the barking stopped, and no matter how far I ran, I couldn't seem to get closer to where the sound had come from. The creek bed twisted through the dark canyon, and soon I was completely lost. My headlamp beam seemed weaker now, barely penetrating the absolute darkness of the forest. I was standing knee-deep in the icy water, completely disoriented, when I heard Rex bark again. But this time, the sound came from behind me, from the direction of my camp. I turned around and started back, but the geography seemed wrong. The creek bed I'd been following split into 3 different channels, none of which looked familiar. My boots slipped on the wet rocks, and I fell hard, soaking my jeans and scraping my palms. By the time I found my way back to the tent, after what felt like hours of wandering, I was hypothermic and exhausted. My phone was dead. My spare batteries had somehow corroded in their waterproof case, and I had no way to judge how much time had passed. Rex was sitting beside my tent, exactly where I'd left him hours earlier. He looked perfectly normal, coat dry, breathing steady, tail wagging slowly when he saw me. If not for the fact that I'd just spent half the night searching for him, I would have thought he'd never moved. "Where the hell were you?" I demanded, my voice cracking from cold and fear. "I heard you barking upstream. How did you get back here?" Rex tilted his head slightly as if confused by my tone. When I knelt to examine him, checking for injuries or signs of where he'd been, his fur was completely dry, not even damp from the heavy dew that had settled on everything else. That was when I noticed his eyes. They were the wrong color. Rex had dark brown eyes, almost black, but the dog sitting in front of me had pale amber eyes that seemed to glow in my headlamp beam. Everything else about him was exactly the same. The markings, the build, even the small scar on his left ear from a puppy mishap. But the eyes were completely different. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. "Rex?" I whispered. He wagged his tail and moved closer, pressing against my legs the way he always did when I was upset. The gesture was so familiar, so comforting, that for a moment I almost convinced myself I was imagining the eye color difference. Maybe it was just the light. Maybe I was more shaken up than I'd realized. But when I looked again, the amber eyes were unmistakable. I backed away slowly. Rex, or whatever was wearing Rex's face, followed, still wagging his tail. When I stopped, he sat and cocked his head, the picture of canine innocence. "You're not Rex," I said, my voice barely audible. The thing that looked like my dog tilted its head further, amber eyes reflecting my headlamp beam. Then, slowly, it began to smile. Dogs don't smile. Not really. They can pant in a way that resembles a grin, but they don't smile with deliberate intent. This thing was smiling at me with human understanding, its lips pulling back to reveal teeth that seemed too sharp, too white. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. The Rex thing maintained its sitting position, but its head continued to tilt at an unnatural angle, further and further until its neck was bent at 90 degrees. The smile never wavered. I turned and ran. I crashed through the forest in blind panic, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, I could hear the Rex thing following. Not running, just walking at that same mechanical pace I'd noticed earlier. It wasn't trying to catch me. It was hurting me. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, then collapsed against a massive pine tree. When I looked back, I couldn't see my headlamp beam reflecting off those amber eyes, but I could feel them watching me from the darkness. My phone was dead, my GPS was useless, and I was lost in a wilderness that seemed to be actively working against me. But worse than any of that was the knowledge that something had taken Rex. Something had studied him closely enough to replicate everything about him except the one detail it couldn't get right. And that something was still out there, wearing his face. I huddled against the tree and tried to think. The rational part of my mind insisted this was all some kind of breakdown. Stress-induced hallucinations, sleep deprivation, hypothermia causing confusion. But the longer I sat there, the more certain I became that what I'd seen was real. Rex was gone. Something else had taken his place. The question was, what did it want with me? I got my answer at dawn. I'd spent the rest of the night pressed against the tree, drifting in and out of consciousness. When the first gray light filtered through the canopy, I could finally see my surroundings clearly. I was in a small clearing surrounded by dead trees. Not the green forest I'd been hiking through yesterday. The trees here were bleached white, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes that hurt to look at. And sitting in the center of the clearing, exactly where I'd left him, was Rex. He looked normal again. Brown eyes, relaxed posture, tongue lolling out slightly as he panted. When he saw me stirring, his tail began to wag, and he trotted over with that familiar bouncing gait. For a moment, I wanted so desperately to believe it was really him that I almost reached out to pet his head. But then I noticed the blood on his muzzle. It was fresh, still wet, and there was too much of it to be from a small woodland creature. Something large had died recently, and Rex, or whatever was pretending to be Rex, had been feeding. "Stay back," I warned, scrambling to my feet. Rex sat and tilted his head, those brown eyes wide and innocent. But when he opened his mouth to pant, I could see that his teeth were stained red. I backed toward the tree line, never taking my eyes off him. He didn't follow immediately, just watched with that patient, predatory stillness I was beginning to recognize. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I turned and ran again. This time, I had a destination in mind. I'd seen a fire tower marked on my map about 2 miles southeast of the original trail. If I could find it, I could call for help, or at least get high enough to orient myself. But the forest seemed determined to prevent my escape. Trails appeared and disappeared without warning. Creek beds led in circles. The sun moved across the sky in ways that defied logic, sometimes rising instead of setting, sometimes disappearing entirely behind clouds that formed and dissipated in seconds. And through it all, Rex was always there. I'd spot him in my peripheral vision, trotting along parallel to my path. When I stopped to rest, he'd sit just within sight, watching. When I tried to approach him, he'd disappear into the trees. When I tried to lose him, he'd reappear ahead of me, as if he knew exactly where I was going. By afternoon, I was beginning to understand the game. He wasn't hunting me in any conventional sense. He was wearing me down, keeping me moving, making sure I didn't rest or think too clearly. Whatever this thing was, it wanted me exhausted and desperate. The worst part was how perfectly it mimicked Rex's behavior. Every gesture, every mannerism was exactly right. If not for the blood on its muzzle and those brief moments when the mask slipped, the wrong eye color, the too wide smile, the unnatural stillness, I would have believed it was really him. As the sun began to set again, or for the third time that day, I'd lost count, I finally saw the fire tower rising above the tree line. It was closer than I'd expected, maybe half a mile away. Hope flickered in my chest for the first time since this nightmare began. I started toward it, pushing through increasingly dense undergrowth. Rex materialized beside me, matching my pace perfectly. He looked tired now, his tongue hanging out, his breathing labored. The sight was so familiar, so normal, that for a moment I forgot he wasn't really my dog. "Almost there, boy," I found myself saying. "Just a little further." Rex looked up at me and wagged his tail. In the fading light, his eyes looked brown again. Human exhaustion and desperation made me want to believe the amber eyes had been a trick of the light, that the blood had been from a rabbit or squirrel, that my best friend was still somehow with me in this horrible place. The fire tower was old and partially collapsed, but the metal stairs looked sturdy enough. I climbed quickly with Rex following behind. Each step took us higher above the canopy, and with each step I felt a little more hopeful. From the observation deck, I could see for miles in every direction. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills covered in pine forest, distant mountains painted purple by the setting sun, and far to the south, the faint glow of electric lights that meant civilization. But I could also see how lost I really was. The landscape below bore no resemblance to the topographical map I'd studied. The creek I'd been following wasn't on any map. The valley where I'd camped shouldn't exist. Rex had climbed up behind me and now sat at the edge of the platform looking out over the forest. In the dying light, he looked exactly like the dog I'd raised from a puppy. My throat tightened with grief for what I'd lost. That's when I heard my own voice calling from the forest below. "Rex! Here, boy! Rex!" I froze, ice water flooding my veins. The voice was perfect. My accent, my inflection, even the slight rasp from shouting. But I hadn't spoken. Rex's ears perked up, and he looked down at the forest with interest. Then he looked back at me, and his eyes were amber again. "Sarah!" my own voice called from below. "Rex, where are you? I've been looking everywhere." Rex stood up and wagged his tail, as if responding to a familiar command. But he kept those alien eyes fixed on my face. "That's not me," I whispered. Rex tilted his head and smiled that terrible, human smile. "Sarah, I'm hurt. I need help." The voice was getting closer. Through the trees, I could see a figure with a headlamp moving toward the base of the tower. Even from this distance, even in the dim light, I could tell it was wearing my face. Rex barked once, a sharp, commanding sound, and the figure below stopped moving. "Good boy," my doppelganger called. "Stay there. I'm coming up." I understood then what I was dealing with. This wasn't just some supernatural predator that had killed Rex. This was something that consumed identities, that studied its prey closely enough to become them. It had been learning me, just as it had learned Rex. The question was, how long had it been watching? I thought back to the beginning of the hike, trying to remember when Rex had first started acting strange. Had it been gradual, or had there been a specific moment when he'd changed? And if the thing could perfectly replicate my appearance and voice, how could I tell where Rex ended and the monster began? The footsteps on the metal stairs were getting closer. In a few minutes, whatever was wearing my face would reach the observation deck, and Rex, or the thing that had been Rex, was blocking my only escape route. I looked down at the forest floor, trying to judge the distance. 50 feet, maybe 60. Probably survivable if I landed right, probably fatal if I didn't. Rex seemed to sense what I was thinking. He moved closer, no longer bothering to maintain the pretense of being a normal dog. His movements were too fluid, too purposeful. When he opened his mouth, the sound that came out wasn't quite a bark. It was something more like laughter. "Sarah." The voice from the stairs was almost to the platform now. "Rex found you. Thank God." I could hear my own relief, my own love for my lost dog, reflected perfectly in that stolen voice. Whatever this thing was, it had learned me well enough to know exactly how I would react to finding Rex safe. But it had made one mistake. I'd been calling Rex by his full name all day, the way I did when I was scared or stressed. But when I was happy, when I was relieved, I called him something else. "Rexy," I shouted as loudly as I could. "Good boy, Rexy." The footsteps on the stairs stopped abruptly. Rex's head snapped toward me, amber eyes wide with what looked like confusion. For just a moment, the mask slipped completely. His features shifted and blurred, like a reflection in disturbed water. I caught a glimpse of something that might have been his true face. Pale, elongated, with too many teeth, before the familiar German Shepherd appearance reasserted itself. But the damage was done. I could see the calculation in those alien eyes, the recalibration as it processed this new information. It was learning, even now. "Rex!" my voice called from below, but now it sounded slightly different. Uncertain. "Rexy, come here, boy." Too late. The thing wearing my face had revealed itself by using the wrong name. I didn't give it time to adapt further. I vaulted over the platform railing and jumped. The fall lasted forever and no time at all. I hit the canopy about halfway down, branches breaking my fall and tearing at my clothes. By the time I reached the ground, I was battered and bleeding, but miraculously unbroken. Above me, I could hear the thing that looked like Rex howling, a sound no dog had ever made. It was answered by my own voice, screaming my name in rage and frustration. I ran through the darkness, guided only by the distant glow of electric lights I'd seen from the tower. Behind me, I could hear them following, multiple sets of footsteps now, moving with inhuman coordination through the dense forest. The chase lasted hours. Every time I thought I'd lost them, I'd hear my own voice calling from a new direction, or catch a glimpse of Rex's familiar silhouette in the moonlight. They were herding me again, but this time toward something specific. I realized what it was when I stumbled out of the tree line and found myself on a paved road. A car was approaching, headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. I ran toward it, waving my arms and shouting for help. The car slowed, and I could see the concerned face of an elderly man behind the wheel. "Please," I gasped as he rolled down his window. "I need help. There's something in the forest." "Sarah?" The man's voice was familiar, tinged with relief. "Thank God we found you." My blood turned to ice. I knew that voice. It was my father. But my father had been dead for 3 years. The man in the car had his face, his voice, even the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident. But his eyes were amber, and when he smiled at me, there were too many teeth. "Get in, sweetheart," he said gently. "Let's get you home." Behind me, I heard Rex bark once, a sound of satisfaction. I looked back at the forest and saw them emerging from the tree line. Rex with his familiar markings and alien eyes, a perfect copy of myself, clothes torn and bloody from the chase, and now my father, impossible and terrible and wrong. They were all learning, collecting, adding to their repertoire. I said, "Get in the car, Sarah." My father's voice was harder now, less patient. Through the windshield I could see other figures in the back seat, indistinct shapes that might have been my mother, my sister, friends I'd lost over the years, all of them staring at me with those same amber eyes. I understood now what had happened to the other hikers who'd gone missing in these mountains. They hadn't died. They'd been collected, studied, replicated, added to something's growing catalog of human experiences. And now it was my turn. "No," I whispered. Then I turned and ran down the road, my bare feet slapping against the asphalt. Behind me, I heard the car doors open and my family's voices calling my name in perfect unison. I ran until my lungs burned and my vision blurred. I ran until I saw the lights of a gas station rising out of the darkness like a beacon. I ran until I collapsed through the front door, gasping and bleeding and probably looking like a madwoman. The clerk, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, stared at me in alarm. "Call the police," I gasped. "Please, there's something in the forest, something that takes people and—" "Ma'am, are you okay?" The woman's voice was kind, concerned, normal. "You look like you've been through hell." I looked into her eyes, searching for that telltale amber glow. But they were brown, human, filled with genuine worry. "I need to call the police," I repeated. She handed me the phone and I dialed 911 with shaking fingers. When the dispatcher answered, I tried to explain what had happened. But how do you tell someone that you've been chased through an impossible forest by things wearing the faces of your loved ones? The state trooper who responded was professional and thorough. He took my statement, checked me for injuries, and even drove me back to where I'd left my car at the trailhead. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, even Rex's leash hanging from the rearview mirror. "We'll organize a search party for your dog," the officer assured me. "Dogs go missing in these mountains all the time, usually turn up in a day or two." I didn't tell him that Rex wasn't missing. I didn't tell him that something was still out there, wearing Rex's face, learning to be him better than he'd ever been himself. 3 weeks later, I was back in Denver, staying with my sister while I tried to put my life back together. The insurance company had paid out for my destroyed gear. The Ranger Service had officially closed the search for Rex after finding no trace of him. Everyone assumed I'd had some kind of breakdown. The stress of the divorce, the isolation of solo hiking, maybe a mild case of altitude sickness or dehydration. It was easier to let them believe that than to try to explain the truth. But I knew what I'd experienced was real, and I knew it wasn't over. The proof came in an email 3 days ago. The sender was listed as Rex Rodriguez, my last name, which Rex had never officially carried. There was no message, just a single attachment. A photo of me sleeping in my sister's guest room, taken from inside the house. In the corner of the image, barely visible in the shadows by the window, was the familiar silhouette of a German shepherd. I've changed all the locks. I've installed a security system. I've even considered buying a gun, though I'm not sure what good it would do against something that can perfectly replicate any living thing. Because that's what I finally understood, sitting in that gas station at dawn, staring into the clerk's normal human eyes. The things in the forest aren't just mimics or shapeshifters, they're something worse. They're perfect students, and I taught them everything they needed to know about being me. Last night I thought I heard Rex barking outside my window. When I looked out, the street was empty except for a woman walking her dog under the streetlights. She had my hair, my build, my way of moving. The dog beside her was a German shepherd with familiar markings. When she looked up at my window, I saw my own face staring back at me. But the eyes were amber, and the smile was too wide. She raised her hand and waved. I closed the curtains and haven't opened them since. But I can still hear them out there, learning to be me better than I ever was. And I know that someday soon, when they've perfected their act, they'll come knocking. And when they do, how will anyone be able to tell the difference? My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 29 years old. At least, I think I am. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself tilting my head too far to one side. Sometimes I notice my reflection's eyes look amber in certain light. Sometimes I find myself smiling that too wide smile that no human face should be able to make. And I wonder, when did the real Sarah Rodriguez die in those mountains? How long have I been the copy, wearing her memories like a borrowed coat? The thing is, I remember being chased. I remember the fear, the confusion, the desperate flight through an impossible forest. But I also remember being the one doing the chasing, studying the prey, learning how to become her. Both sets of memories feel equally real. So maybe the real horror isn't what happened to me in the Black Hills. Maybe it's what I brought back with me. Maybe I'm the thing wearing Sarah Rodriguez's face, telling her story so perfectly that even I believe it's true. And if that's the case, then what does that make the woman writing this confession? What does that make you, the person reading it? After all, once you've heard my story, learned my words, absorbed my memories, how can you be sure you're still entirely yourself? The amber eyes are just the beginning. Soon, you'll be smiling too. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Black Hills of South Dakota, 3 miles past the last marked trail, where the pine trees grow so thick they swallow sound, and the GPS signals die like prayers in an empty church. I should have listened to the park ranger who warned us about the unmarked trails. Should have paid attention to the way his weathered face tightened when Marcus showed him our planned route on the crumpled topographical map. But I was too focused on proving something to myself, that I could handle the wilderness, that I wasn't the same broken woman who'd spent 6 months in therapy after the accident. The accident. Even now, writing this with bandaged hands and a mind that keeps slipping like loose gravel, I can smell the twisted metal and hear glass crunching under emergency boots. My little sister Elena, 12 years old, telling me she was scared of the storm as I pulled out onto Highway 14, the semi-truck running the red light, the way her voice just stopped. That was 14 months ago. This camping trip with my 3 closest friends was supposed to be my re-entry into living. Instead, it became something else entirely. Marcus Chen had organized everything with his typical obsessive precision. Best friend since college, the kind of guy who color-coded his hiking gear and researched weather patterns 6 weeks in advance. He'd been pushing me to get back outdoors ever since the doctors cleared me for physical activity. "Nature heals," he'd say, which felt patronizing until I realized he genuinely believed it might help. Emma Thompson was our group's unofficial therapist, though she taught 4th grade and had never hiked anything more challenging than a city park trail. Petite and freckled, with a laugh that could dissolve tension, she'd volunteered to come along as emotional support. She kept making terrible jokes about bears and promising she'd brought enough granola bars to feed a small army. Then there was Jake Sullivan, Emma's boyfriend of 2 years, a paramedic who seemed to view every outdoor activity as a potential rescue scenario. He'd packed a medical kit that weighed more than my entire backpack and kept pointing out which plants were poisonous with the enthusiasm of someone who'd actually treated people for eating them. We'd driven up from Rapid City on a Friday morning in October, the aspens already turning gold against the pine-dark slopes. Our destination was an unmarked camping spot Marcus had found through some obscure hiking forum. A hidden meadow, allegedly untouched by tourist traffic, accessible only by a challenging but rewarding 3-mile hike through old-growth forest. The trailhead parking was empty except for a rusted pickup truck with South Dakota plates and a back window shot through with what looked like bullet holes. Jake made a joke about horror movie cliches, but his voice carried an edge that suggested he wasn't entirely kidding. The marked trail lasted exactly 1.7 miles before peters out at a fallen pine that must have come down in a storm. Marcus consulted his GPS, frowned, then pulled out his compass and the printed directions he'd gotten from the forum. "This is where it gets interesting," he said, shouldering his pack. "We head northeast for about 50 yards, then followed the creek bed up the slope." The creek was barely a trickle, more mud than water, and it led us deeper into forest that seemed to press closer with each step. The pine canopy grew so thick that by early afternoon we were hiking in permanent twilight. My boots squelched in bog that smelled of rotting leaves and something else, something sharp and organic that made my sinuses burn. Emma was the first to mention the silence. No bird calls, no insect hum, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just our labored breathing and the wet sound of our footsteps. "It's probably just the elevation," Marcus said, but he kept checking his GPS and shaking his head. The screen showed our location as a blue dot floating in blank gray space. No topographical features, no landmarks. "We should have reached the meadow by now," Jake muttered, pausing to retie his boot. When he straightened up, his face was flushed and sweaty despite the cool air. "According to your directions, it should be just over this ridge." We crested what we hoped was the right ridge and found ourselves looking down into a narrow valley carpeted with scrub brush and bisected by the same muddy creek. No meadow, no clearing, just more forest stretching endlessly in every direction. Marcus's carefully planned campsite didn't exist. "Maybe we took a wrong turn," Emma suggested, though we both knew we'd been following the only possible path for the last hour. Marcus was staring at his GPS like it had personally betrayed him. The screen flickered between showing our location and displaying an error message. "GPS signal lost." Then it would flicker back to the blue dot in gray nothingness. "We'll make camp here," Jake decided, his paramedic training taking over. "It's getting dark, and we need to set up before we lose the light." The light? I looked up and realized the sky was already deep purple, though my watch said it was only 4:30 p.m. Sunset shouldn't come for another 2 hours, but the forest canopy made it impossible to tell where the sun actually was in the sky. We set up our tents in a rough circle around where we planned to build the fire. Emma's one-person tent, mine and Marcus's small dome tent, and Jake's larger expedition shelter that he'd insisted on bringing just in case. The ground was soft and spongy, covered with a thick layer of pine needles that released a sharp, almost medicinal smell when we cleared them away. Jake gathered deadwood while Marcus tried to get a cell signal. Emma sat on a fallen log, unnaturally quiet, staring into the trees. I busied myself with organizing our food supplies, trying to ignore the way shadows seemed to move independently of any breeze. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. Our food was wrong. Not spoiled exactly, but off. The bread Emma had bought that morning felt stale and hard. The apples Marcus had packed were wrinkled and soft as if they'd been aging for weeks. Even the sealed packages, crackers, dried fruit, energy bars, felt different, heavier, denser. "Did anyone else notice?" I started to say, then stopped. Jake was crouched over our carefully arranged kindling, striking match after match. Each one would flare briefly, then die before touching the tinder. "Matches might be damp," he muttered, trying another. This one burned for a few seconds longer, actually caught the edge of a dry leaf, then guttered out as if something had blown it away. But there was no wind. Marcus gave up on his phone and came over to help. He had one of those fancy fire-starting tools, magnesium rod and steel striker. The sparks cascaded properly, bright white against the gathering darkness, but they wouldn't catch. The tinder would smoke, even glow for a moment, then fade back to cold ash. "This is ridiculous," Emma said. She'd been watching our efforts with growing frustration. "It's not that humid. The wood is dry." She was right. I picked up a piece of the kindling Jake had gathered. Bone dry, lightweight, perfect for starting a fire. But every time we got the smallest flame going, it would die like someone was holding their breath on it. By the time we gave up, full darkness had fallen. Not the soft darkness of a normal evening, but something thicker, more absolute. Our flashlights seemed dimmer, their beams swallowed by the trees after only a few feet. We ate cold sandwiches and shared a bottle of water that tasted faintly of rust. Nobody said much. Emma kept glancing over her shoulder. Marcus obsessively checked and rechecked his GPS. Jake methodically inventoried his medical supplies, as if preparing for an emergency he could feel coming. I tried to sleep, but couldn't. My sleeping bag felt damp and cold despite being brand new. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear Elena's voice from that night in the car. "Sarah, I'm scared. Can we go home?" The same words, over and over, until I wanted to scream. But worse than the memories were the sounds from outside our tent. Breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing that circled our campsite like a predator pacing the perimeter. When I strained to listen, it would stop. When I relaxed, it would start again. Deep inhales and exhales that didn't match the rhythm of any sleeping animal I knew. Around midnight, Marcus unzipped his sleeping bag and whispered, "Do you hear that?" I nodded in the darkness. "What is it?" "I don't know." We lay there listening for another hour. The breathing continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always there. Once I thought I heard footsteps, the soft pad of bare feet on pine needles, but when I looked out through the tent's mesh window, I saw only blackness. Morning came abruptly, like someone had flipped a switch. One moment I was lying in thick darkness listening to that horrible breathing. The next, the forest was bright with filtered sunlight. The breathing had stopped. Emma emerged from her tent looking haggard, dark circles under her eyes. "Did anyone else?" "Yeah," Jake said grimly. He was already dressed and rolling up his sleeping bag. "We all heard it." Marcus was studying his GPS again. The screen showed the same thing, a blue dot in empty gray space. But now there was something else. Our position had moved during the night. According to the device, we were now several miles from where we'd made camp, though none of us had left our tents. "That's impossible," Emma said, looking over his shoulder. "We didn't move." Marcus shook his head. "GPS doesn't lie. We're not where we were yesterday." I looked around the campsite. Everything appeared exactly as we'd left it. Our tents in the same circle, our gear in the same piles. Even the cold ashes of our failed fire were undisturbed. But something felt different. Wrong. The trees seemed taller. The shadows fell at different angles. And the smell, that sharp organic odor I'd noticed yesterday, was stronger now, almost overwhelming. "We need to head back," Jake said. "Something's not right here." But when we packed up and tried to retrace our steps, we couldn't find the way we'd come. The creek that had led us into the valley was gone. Where it should have been, the ground was bone dry, covered with rocks that looked like they'd been undisturbed for decades. Marcus led us upslope, following his compass northeast toward where he thought the main trail should be. We hiked for 3 hours through forest that looked identical in every direction. The same towering pines, the same carpet of needles, the same gray-green light filtering through the canopy. We should have reached the marked trail. We should have seen other hikers, or at least some sign of human presence. Instead, we found ourselves in another small valley, this one containing the remnants of what might have been a cabin. Just a foundation of stacked stones and a few rotting logs overgrown with moss and ferns. Emma sat down heavily on one of the stones. "We're lost." "No," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We just need to get our bearings. The GPS will start working once we get to higher ground." Jake was examining the cabin ruins. "This place has been abandoned for a long time." He pointed to a rusted metal object half buried in the undergrowth. "That's a wood stove, cast iron, probably been here since the 1800s. I wandered to the far edge of the clearing where something white caught my eye. Bones, small ones, picked clean and scattered, rabbit maybe, or squirrel, but there were so many of them, and they were arranged in strange patterns, almost like Sarah." Emma's voice was sharp with fear. "Look at this." She was standing beside what remained of the cabin's back wall, pointing at something carved into the bark of a massive pine tree. At first glance, it looked like random scratches, but when I stepped closer, I could see they were symbols, or maybe letters in an alphabet I didn't recognize. But it was what hung from the tree that made my blood freeze. Dozens of small objects dangled from the lower branches. At first I thought they were pine cones or seed pods. Then I realized they were bones. Tiny bones threaded on what looked like sinew, clicking gently against each other in the breeze. "We need to leave," Jake said quietly. "Now." We didn't argue. Marcus shouldered his pack without checking the GPS, and we headed out of the clearing as quickly as we could. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever had lived in that cabin, or currently lived there, knew we'd found it. The afternoon wore on, and our situation became increasingly desperate. We were definitively lost. The compass spun wildly, pointing in different directions every time Marcus checked it. Our water was running low, and the forest around us seemed to be changing in subtle but undeniable ways. The trees were different, taller and more twisted, with bark that looked almost scaly in places. The undergrowth was thicker, forcing us to push through tangles of thornbush that left scratches on our arms and legs. And the silence was complete now. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind in the branches. "There," Marcus said, pointing through the trees. "I think I see a trail." It was barely visible, just a faint depression in the forest floor where the undergrowth was a little thinner. But it was the first sign of human passage we'd seen all day. We followed it downhill through increasingly dense forest. The trail was old, probably made by animals rather than people, but it gave us direction and hope. Maybe it would lead to water, or to a road, or at least to some landmark Marcus could use to figure out where we were. Instead, it led us to another clearing. This one was different from the cabin ruins, smaller, more recent. The remains of a campfire sat in the center, surrounded by flat stones arranged in a perfect circle. Someone had been here recently. The ashes were still white and fine, not yet scattered by weather. Emma approached the fire ring cautiously. "Hello," she called. "Is anyone here?" Her voice echoed strangely in the clearing, as if the trees were throwing it back at us. I was about to tell her to stop when we heard an answer. "Help me." The voice came from somewhere in the forest beyond the clearing, faint and desperate, barely audible above the whisper of wind through pine needles. "Help me, please." Jake dropped his pack and started toward the sound. "Someone's hurt." "Wait," I said, catching his arm. Something about the voice bothered me, though I couldn't put my finger on what. "Help me, I'm lost." It was closer now, coming from our left. Marcus had his flashlight out even though it was still daylight, sweeping the beam across the trees. "Where are you?" Jake called. "Keep talking so we can find you." Here, I'm here. Please help me. The voice was definitely closer, maybe 30 yards into the forest. But there was something wrong with it, something that made my skin crawl. Help me, help me, help me. The same words, over and over, with exactly the same inflection, like a recording being played on loop. Emma grabbed my hand. Sarah, that's not, help me, help me, help me, help me. Now it was coming from multiple directions. The same voice, the same desperate plea, but from at least 3 different locations around the clearing. Marcus's flashlight beam found movement in the trees. A figure standing just at the edge of visibility, motionless among the pines. There, he whispered. Do you see it? I saw it. Tall and thin, wearing what looked like hiking clothes, just standing there perfectly still while that horrible repeated plea echoed around us. Help me, help me, help me, help me. Jake started toward the figure, his medical training overriding his instincts. Are you injured? What happened? The figure didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there while the voice continued its mechanical repetition. Help me, help me, help me, help me. That's not coming from him, Emma said, her voice tight with fear. His mouth isn't moving. She was right. The figure stood motionless, arms at its sides, head tilted at an unnatural angle. But the voice kept calling from all around us, growing louder and more insistent. Marcus's flashlight beam wavered, and in that moment of movement, the figure was gone. Where did it go? Jake spun around, searching the trees. Help me, help me, help me, help me. The voice was everywhere now, coming from above us, below us, from inside the very trees themselves. And underneath it, barely audible, I could hear something else. Laughter. We need to go, I said. Right now. But as we turned to leave the clearing, we found our way blocked. 3 figures stood at the edge of the forest, spaced evenly around the perimeter, all wearing hiking clothes, all standing perfectly still with their heads tilted at that same unnatural angle. Help me, help me, help me, help me. The voices were overlapping now, creating a horrible chorus that seemed to burrow into my brain. And underneath it all, that soft, malicious laughter. Emma was hyperventilating. Marcus's hands shook as he tried to find another way out of the clearing. Jake reached for his pack, probably going for his medical kit, but stopped when he realized what he was looking at. The figures weren't people. Not anymore. Their skin was wrong, too pale with a grayish tint that suggested something dead. Their eyes were black holes in their faces. And when one of them moved, taking a single step forward, I could see that its joints bent the wrong way. Help me, help me, help me, help me. The figures were closing in, moving with that same unnatural gait. Behind them, more shapes appeared in the forest. Dozens of them, all wearing the clothes of hikers and campers, all with that same terrible stillness. The fire ring, Marcus said suddenly. Get in the fire ring. I didn't understand why, but desperation made me follow his lead. We huddled together in the center of the stone circle while the figures pressed closer. Help me, help me, help me, help me. They stopped at the edge of the stones. All of them, standing in a perfect circle around us, their black eyes fixed on our faces. The mechanical voices continued, but underneath them I could hear something new. Breathing. The same slow, deliberate breathing we'd heard outside our tents the night before. But now I could see where it was coming from. The figures' chests rose and fell with exaggerated movements, as if something inside them was working very hard to mimic the act of being alive. What do they want? Emma whispered. Marcus was studying the stone circle, running his hands along the flat rocks. This is protection, he said. Someone built this as protection. The figures stood there for what felt like hours, though my watch said only 10 minutes had passed. The mechanical pleas gradually faded to whispers, then stopped altogether. But they didn't leave. They just stood there, waiting. As darkness fell, their eyes began to glow. Not the bright reflection of a flashlight, but a soft phosphorescence that pulsed in rhythm with their breathing. In that eerie light I could see their faces more clearly. They had been people once. I could see enough human features to know that. But something had changed them, hollowed them out and filled them with something else. Something that wore their shapes but didn't understand how to properly inhabit them. "We can't stay here all night," Jake said. "We need water, food." "We need to survive until morning," Marcus replied. "That's all." But I wasn't sure morning would make any difference. These things, whatever they were, didn't seem bound by normal rules. They'd moved our campsite during the night without touching anything. They'd made our GPS show impossible locations. They'd changed the very landscape around us. Around midnight, one of them spoke. Not the mechanical plea for help, but actual words in a voice I recognized. "Sarah? Are you there?" It was Elena's voice, my dead sister's voice, coming from the mouth of one of those horrible figures. "Sarah, I'm scared. Can we go home?" I closed my eyes and tried to block it out, but the voice continued. "Why didn't you save me, Sarah? Why did you let me die?" "It's not her," Emma whispered, gripping my hand. "Whatever that thing is, it's not your sister." "Sarah, please. I'm scared. It's dark here. It's so dark." The figure stepped closer to the stone circle, and in the phosphorescent glow of its eyes, I could almost see Elena's face. Almost. "Don't listen to it," Marcus said. "It's trying to break you down." But the voice was so perfect. Every inflection exactly as I remembered it. Elena's slight lisp on the letter S, the way she always started sentences with my name when she was frightened. "Sarah, why did you leave me in the car? Why didn't you come back for me?" That wasn't right. Elena hadn't been left in the car. She'd been sitting right beside me when the truck hit us. But the thing wearing her voice didn't know that. It was guessing, trying different combinations of guilt and fear to see what would work. "You're not Elena," I said, standing up despite the others' protests. "My sister died instantly. She didn't suffer, and she would never blame me for what happened." The figure tilted its head further, impossibly far, until its neck was bent at a 90-degree angle. "Sarah," it said, but the voice was changing now, becoming something else, something mechanical and hollow. "Help me." The other figures took up the chant again, but louder now, more insistent. "Help me, help me, help me, help me." The sound was overwhelming, a cacophony that seemed to come from inside my own skull. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside me now, burrowing through my thoughts like parasites. Then, suddenly, they stopped. The figures were gone. All of them, vanished like they'd never been there. The clearing was empty except for the four of us huddled in the stone circle. "Where did they go?" Emma whispered. Before anyone could answer, we heard footsteps. Human footsteps, approaching through the forest. A few seconds later, a familiar figure emerged from the trees. It was Jake. Not the Jake sitting beside me in the stone circle, but another Jake. Identical in every way, wearing the same clothes, carrying the same pack. He looked tired and disheveled, like he'd been hiking for hours. "Thank God," the second Jake said, stumbling into the clearing. "I've been looking for you guys all night. Got separated when that storm hit." Emma stared at him, then at the Jake beside her. "What storm?" "The storm that came through around 8 o'clock. Huge lightning strike knocked a tree down right across our path. I thought you were right behind me, but when I looked back, you were gone." The Jake in the stone circle stood up slowly. There was no storm. The two Jakes faced each other across the clearing, identical except for their expressions. Our Jake looked confused and frightened. The other one looked wrong. His smile was too wide, his eyes too bright. "Of course there was a storm," the second Jake said. "Don't you remember? Emma was terrified of the lightning. She kept saying she wanted to go home." I felt Emma tense beside me. She'd never said anything about wanting to go home. Neither Jake would know that. "You're not, Jake," Marcus said quietly. The thing wearing Jake's face turned toward him, and for just a moment its features slipped. The skin rippled like water, revealing something dark and formless underneath. "Help me," it said in Jake's voice. "I'm lost." Then it lunged. Marcus tackled me sideways as the thing that looked like Jake leaped across the stone circle. Its fingers had become claws, long and black and sharp. Where it landed, the stones cracked. The real Jake grabbed a rock from the fire ring and threw it at the creature's head. The impact made a wet, hollow sound like hitting rotten fruit. The thing staggered, but didn't fall. "Run!" Jake shouted. "Everyone run!" We scattered in different directions, crashing through the undergrowth. I could hear the thing behind us, making sounds no human throat could produce. Wet, chittering sounds like an insect trying to speak. I ran blindly through the forest, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, Emma was screaming. Somewhere to my left, Marcus was shouting instructions that I couldn't understand over the sound of my own panicked breathing. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, then collapsed behind a fallen tree to catch my breath. The forest was silent except for my ragged gasping. No footsteps, no inhuman chittering, no sound from the others. I was alone. I tried to call out, but my voice was barely a whisper. I tried to stand, but my legs were shaking too badly to support my weight. So I sat there in the darkness, listening to my heartbeat and trying to figure out what to do next. That's when I heard Emma calling my name. "Sarah? Sarah, where are you? I'm hurt." The voice was coming from deeper in the forest, maybe 50 yards away. It sounded like Emma, but I remembered the thing that had worn Jake's face. "Sarah, please. I think my ankle is broken. I can't walk." I forced myself to stand and started moving toward the voice, but carefully. If it was really Emma, I had to help her. If it wasn't, "Sarah, I'm scared. Please don't leave me." The voice was closer now. I could see a figure sitting at the base of a large pine tree, holding one leg at an awkward angle. In the darkness, it looked exactly like Emma. "Emma?" I whispered. "Is that really you?" The figure looked up, and I saw Emma's face. Tear-streaked and frightened, but definitely Emma. "Sarah, thank God. Something's wrong with my ankle. I think I twisted it when I fell." I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming that this was a trap. But as I got closer, I could see details that the thing in the clearing had gotten wrong. The way Emma tucked her hair behind her left ear when she was nervous. The small scar on her chin from a childhood accident. The freckles on her nose that formed a pattern I'd memorized during years of friendship. "Let me see," I said, kneeling beside her. Her ankle was swollen and already starting to bruise. When I touched it gently, she winced in pain. "I don't think it's broken," I said, "but you shouldn't walk on it." "What happened back there?" Emma asked. "That thing that looked like Jake?" "I don't know, some kind of mimic. Something that copies people." Emma nodded, then looked around the dark forest. "Where are the others?" "I don't know. We got separated when we ran. We need to find them." "We need to get out of here," I corrected. "That thing could be anywhere. It could be copying any of us." Emma was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she said, "How do we know we're really us?" The question sent a chill down my spine. How could we know? The creature had perfectly copied Jake's appearance. If it could do that, what was to stop it from copying our memories, our personalities, our relationships? "Ask me something only Emma would know," I said. Emma thought for a moment. "What did I give you for your birthday last year?" "A book of poems by Mary Oliver. You said it reminded you of me because I always loved being outdoors." She smiled. "Your turn." "What happened the night we met in college?" "You were crying in the dorm bathroom because your roommate was having loud sex and you couldn't sleep. I gave you my earplugs and we stayed up all night talking about everything except why you were really crying." I remembered. It had been 2 weeks after Elena's death, and I'd been falling apart in slow motion. Emma had saved me that night just by being there. "It's really you," I said. "It's really me. Now help me up. We need to find Marcus and Jake." I fashioned a crutch from a fallen branch and helped Emma to her feet. She could hobble along, but slowly. Every few steps we had to stop and listen for sounds of the others. We found Marcus first. He was sitting in a small clearing, methodically checking his GPS and compass. When he saw us approaching, he relaxed visibly. "Emma, Sarah, thank God. Are you hurt?" "Emma twisted her ankle," I said. "But we're okay. What about Jake?" Marcus's expression darkened. "I don't know. We got separated right after we ran. I've been calling his name, but—" "We need to be careful," Emma said. "That thing could be pretending to be him." Marcus nodded. "I thought about that. How do we know if it's really him?" Before I could answer, we heard Jake calling from somewhere nearby. "Marcus? Emma? Sarah? Where is everyone?" His voice sounded normal. Tired and scared, but normal. "Over here," Marcus called back. Jake appeared through the trees a few minutes later, looking disheveled but unharmed. He ran to us with obvious relief. "Is everyone okay? Emma, what happened to your ankle?" "I twisted it running," she said. "It's not serious." Jake knelt down to examine her ankle, his hands gentle and professional. "Definitely sprained. We need to get some elevation and ice on this." "Ice?" I said. "Jake, we're lost in the middle of nowhere." He looked up at me, and for a moment his expression was blank. Then he smiled. "Sorry, force of habit. Cold water, then, and we should wrap it." He pulled medical supplies from his pack and began bandaging Emma's ankle. His technique was perfect, exactly what I'd expect from a paramedic. But something felt off. "Jake," Marcus said casually, "what's the first thing you're going to do when we get home?" Jake paused in his bandaging. "Take a hot shower, order pizza, sleep in my own bed." All perfectly normal answers. The kind of thing anyone would say. But Emma and I exchanged glances. The real Jake would have mentioned checking in with his supervisor or reviewing whatever emergency calls he'd missed, or any of a dozen work-related tasks. His job wasn't something he could just switch off. "What about you, Emma?" Jake continued. "Looking forward to getting back to your fourth graders?" Emma smiled. "Actually, I teach third grade." Jake's hands stilled on the bandage. "Right, third grade. Sorry, I'm just tired." It was a small mistake, easy to explain away. But the real Jake had helped Emma set up her classroom at the beginning of the school year. He'd painted bulletin boards and carried boxes and complained good-naturedly about the alphabet song being stuck in his head for days afterward. He would never forget what grade she taught. Marcus caught my eye and nodded slightly. He'd noticed, too. "We should get moving," the thing wearing Jake's face said. "Find a good place to camp for the night." "Actually," I said, "I think we should try to get out of here. Keep walking until we find the main trail." "In the dark? With Emma injured? That's not safe." Jake was right, of course. It wasn't safe, but neither was camping with something that might kill us in our sleep. "I agree with Sarah," Emma said. "I can walk. It'll be slow, but I can do it." The fake Jake's expression flickered, just for a moment. Something cold and alien looked out through his eyes. "Fine," he said. "But if someone gets hurt, don't blame me." We started walking, Marcus leading with his compass, Emma leaning on her makeshift crutch, me and the thing that looked like Jake bringing up the rear. I kept glancing back at it, trying to spot some tell that would prove what I already knew. It was good. Almost perfect. It had Jake's mannerisms, his way of walking, even his habit of adjusting his pack straps every few minutes. But it didn't have his instincts. The real Jake would have been constantly checking on Emma's ankle, making sure she wasn't pushing herself too hard. This thing just followed along, occasionally making the right concerned noises but never actually helping. We walked for what felt like hours. The forest around us remained unchanging, the same towering pines, the same thick undergrowth, the same oppressive silence. Marcus's compass spun wildly, pointing in different directions every few minutes. According to his GPS, we were now moving through an area that didn't exist on any map. "This is impossible," Marcus muttered, staring at the device. "We should have hit a road by now, or a trail, or something." "Maybe we're going in circles," the fake Jake suggested. "No, I've been marking trees as we pass. We're moving in a straight line, but we're not getting anywhere." Emma sat down heavily on a fallen log. "I need to rest." I sat beside her, grateful for the break. My feet were blistered inside my hiking boots, and my shoulders ached from the weight of my pack. But more than physical exhaustion, I was worn down by the constant fear. That's when I noticed the trees. We were in a grove of aspens now, their white bark ghostly in the darkness. But these aspens were wrong. The bark was scored with deep gouges, as if something with enormous claws had been sharpening them on the trunks. And hanging from the branches. "Do you see those?" I whispered to Emma. She followed my gaze upward and gasped. Dozens of objects dangled from the aspen branches. Clothes, hiking boots, backpacks, all of it looking old and weathered, as if it had been hanging there for years. Marcus noticed us staring and looked up. "What the hell?" The fake Jake was examining one of the lower-hanging objects. "This is a Park Service uniform," he said. "Ranger patch and everything." I stood up and moved closer to one of the trees. A child's jacket hung from a branch just above my head, small enough to fit a 10-year-old. Below it, a pair of tiny hiking boots swayed gently in the breeze. "How many people have gotten lost here?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible. "Not lost," the fake Jake said. "Taken." The way he said it made me turn around. He was smiling, but it wasn't Jake's smile. It was too wide, too knowing. "Taken by what?" Marcus demanded. The thing wearing Jake's face tilted its head, considering the question. "By us." That's when its features began to shift. The changes were subtle at first. Jake's brown eyes darkened to black. His skin took on that same grayish pallor I'd seen on the figures in the clearing. His smile stretched wider and wider until it split his face from ear to ear. "Help me," it said in Jake's voice. "I'm lost." Then it lunged at Marcus. I grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her off the log just as the creature crashed into the spot where she'd been sitting. Its claws. Jake's hands had become claws, gouged deep furrows in the bark. Marcus scrambled backward, trying to get his pack off so he could reach whatever weapons he'd brought. The creature pursued him with inhuman speed, its joints bending in ways that made me sick to watch. "The trees!" Emma shouted. "Climb the trees!" We ran for the nearest aspen, its smooth bark offering little in the way of handholds. Behind us, the creature that had been Jake was making those wet, chittering sounds again. Marcus screamed. I boosted Emma up to the lowest branch, then hauled myself up after her. The bark was slippery and my hands were shaking, but adrenaline gave me strength I didn't know I had. Below us, Marcus was on the ground. The creature crouched over him, its face now completely inhuman. Where Jake's features had been, there was something else. Something that looked like it had been stitched together from parts of different people. "Marcus!" I called down. "Marcus, can you hear me?" He turned his head toward my voice. Blood ran from his nose and ears, but he was conscious. "I can't move my legs," he said. The creature looked up at us with its black eyes and smiled. When it spoke, it was in Jake's voice again. "Don't worry," it said. "I'll take good care of him." It picked Marcus up as easily as lifting a child and carried him away into the darkness. We could hear him calling our names until the forest swallowed his voice. Emma and I clung to the aspen tree, too terrified to move. Below us, more shapes began to emerge from the forest. Dozens of them, all wearing the clothes of hikers and campers, all with that same unnatural stillness. They surrounded the tree and looked up at us with phosphorescent eyes. "Help me," they said in unison. "Help me, help me, help me." The sound was deafening, echoing through the forest like the cry of some massive, dying animal. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside my head now, drilling through my thoughts. "Help me, help me, help me, Help me." Emma was crying, great silent sobs that shook her entire body. I wrapped my arms around her and held on, as much for my own comfort as hers. The creatures stood there all night, chanting their mechanical plea. As dawn approached, their voices grew fainter, and their forms began to fade like mist. By the time the sun rose, they were gone. We climbed down from the tree on shaking legs. My hands were raw and bleeding from gripping the bark, and Emma could barely walk on her injured ankle. But we were alive. "We have to find Marcus," Emma said. I wanted to tell her that Marcus was dead, that we needed to focus on getting ourselves out of this nightmare, but I couldn't bring myself to crush her hope. "Okay," I said, "but we stay together, no matter what happens." We searched the grove for any sign of where the creature had taken Marcus. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, but I couldn't find any clear tracks. It was as if he'd simply vanished. That's when I noticed something glinting in the leaf litter near the base of one of the aspens. Marcus's GPS device, cracked but still functional. I picked it up and checked the screen. Our location showed as the same gray void it had been displaying for days. But there was something new. A waypoint marked with a red X, labeled Home. "Look at this," I showed Emma the screen. "What does it mean?" "I think it's showing us where they took him." The waypoint was less than a mile away, due north through the forest. We could reach it in an hour, even with Emma's injured ankle. "It could be a trap," Emma said. "Probably. But what choice do we have?" We gathered what supplies we had left and started north. The forest around us began to change as we walked. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their branches forming a canopy so thick that almost no light penetrated to the ground. The undergrowth became sparse and sickly, as if the soil itself was poisoned. And everywhere, hanging from the branches, were more clothes, more backpacks, more boots, decades' worth of hiking gear, all of it belonging to people who had vanished into these woods. After 45 minutes of walking, we smelled smoke. "Campfire," Emma whispered. I nodded. We were close. We crept forward through the trees until we could see a clearing ahead. In the center was a large fire, burning with flames that seemed too bright and too blue. Around the fire sat dozens of figures in hiking clothes, all motionless, all staring into the flames. Marcus was there. He sat cross-legged on the far side of the fire, his eyes reflecting the strange light. But something was wrong with his posture. His head was tilted at that same unnatural angle I'd seen before. "Marcus," Emma whispered. He turned toward us, and I saw that his face had changed. Not completely. He was still recognizably Marcus, but his eyes were black holes and his skin had taken on that grayish tint. "Help me," he said in his own voice. "I'm lost." Emma started forward, but I caught her arm. "That's not Marcus anymore." "But it's his voice, his face. It's what they do. They copy people. Perfectly." The figure that looked like Marcus stood up and walked toward us. The other figures around the fire remained motionless, but I could feel their attention turning in our direction. "Emma," the Marcus thing said. "Sarah, you found me." "Marcus, what happened to you?" Emma asked. "I got lost, but they helped me. They showed me the way home." He gestured toward the fire, and I could see something moving in the flames, shapes that might have been human, writhing in the blue light. "They want to help you too," the Marcus thing continued. "All you have to do is sit by the fire. Rest. You've been walking for so long." I felt the pull of its words, the promise of rest and warmth. My feet hurt. My shoulders ached. The fire looked so inviting. "Don't listen to it," I told Emma. "We need to go." But Emma was already walking toward the fire, drawn by the Marcus thing's voice. "Emma, no!" I lunged forward and tackled her, knocking us both to the ground. The impact jarred her out of whatever trance she'd been in. "What? Where?" "We have to run. Now!" The figures around the fire were standing up, turning toward us with their black eyes and impossible smiles. The Marcus thing's face was changing, becoming something else, something made of shadows and teeth. We ran. Behind us I could hear the creatures giving chase, not the slow, mechanical pursuit of the night before, but something faster and more desperate. They crashed through the undergrowth like wild animals, making sounds that hurt my ears. I pulled Emma along as fast as her injured ankle would allow, but I knew we couldn't outrun them. They were gaining ground with every step. That's when I saw it. A structure through the trees ahead. Old and wooden, covered with moss and vines. It looked like a ranger station or fire lookout, abandoned decades ago. There, I pointed, the building. We stumbled through the front door just as the first creature broke through the tree line behind us. I slammed the door and threw the bolt, but I could hear them outside, circling the building. The interior was a single room filled with rotting furniture and broken equipment. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the wallboards, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Emma collapsed in a corner, exhausted. What is this place? I examined the walls more closely. They were covered with scratches, like the ones we'd seen on the trees. But these weren't random. They were words, carved into the wood by desperate hands. They copy us. Don't trust anyone. The fire takes your soul. Day 47, still alive. Sarah, if you read this, I love you. That last one stopped me cold. Carved in shaky letters near the door, written in a handwriting I recognized. Elena's handwriting. Emma, I called. Look at this. She limped over and read the message. Who's Elena? My sister. She died in a car accident over a year ago. Then who wrote this? Before I could answer, we heard a voice outside, soft and familiar. Sarah, are you in there? Elena's voice. Sarah, please. I've been looking for you for so long. I'm scared. Emma grabbed my arm. Don't listen to it. Sarah, why won't you answer me? I just want to go home. I closed my eyes and tried to block out the voice, but it was so perfect. Every inflection exactly as I remembered. Please, Sarah, I forgive you for the accident. I know it wasn't your fault. Just open the door. My hand moved toward the bolt before I could stop it. The voice was so persuasive, so full of love and forgiveness, everything I'd wanted to hear for the past 14 months. Sarah, don't, Emma whispered. She forgives me, I said. She says it wasn't my fault. It's not her. You know it's not her. But what if it is? What if she's been trapped here all this time? Sarah, Emma's voice was firm. Your sister is dead. That thing outside is not her. I knew she was right. In the rational part of my mind, I knew Elena was dead and buried and gone. But the voice outside sounded so real, so much like the sister I'd lost. Sarah, I'm getting cold. Please let me in. I reached for the bolt again, and Emma knocked my hand away. No, whatever that thing is, it's not Elena. Don't let it in. Outside, the voice began to change. The words were still Elena's, but the tone became harder, more demanding. Sarah, open this door right now. You owe me that much. That wasn't right. Elena had never talked to me like that, even when she was angry. You killed me, Sarah. The least you can do is let me in. I stepped back from the door, finally understanding. The thing outside didn't know Elena. It was guessing, trying different emotional manipulations to see what would work. You're not my sister, I said loudly. The voice outside became a shriek of rage, no longer human. Something began pounding on the door, making the entire building shake. Emma and I huddled in the center of the room while the creatures outside tried to break in. They clawed at the walls, climbed onto the roof, pressed against the windows. But the building held. Why can't they get in? Emma asked. I looked around the room again, paying closer attention to the carved messages. Most of them were desperate pleas or warnings, but some were different. Instructions. Salt circle around building. Iron nails in door frame. Blessed silver in windows. Someone had fortified this place. Someone who understood what we were fighting. As night fell, the attacks intensified. The creatures outside made sounds like nothing I'd ever heard, screams and howls and that horrible chittering. But they couldn't enter. We found supplies in an old locker, water, canned food, even a battery-powered radio. Most importantly, we found a notebook filled with handwritten pages. It was a journal, written by a park ranger named Tom Bradley. The entries were dated over a 2-month period 3 years ago. Day 1. Hikers reported missing in Sector 7. Organized search party. Day 3. Search party found abandoned campsite. No sign of struggle. GPS equipment malfunctioning. Day 7. Found Johnson and Martinez. They seemed fine, but something was wrong. Kept asking for help even when we were helping them. Day 12. Johnson tried to kill Martinez in his sleep. Had to shoot him. When he died, his face changed. Wasn't human underneath. Day 18. They're copying us. Taking our shapes, our voices, our memories. Can't trust anyone. Day 23. Barricaded myself in the old station. They can't get in. Something about this place protects against them. Day 31. Radio still works. Tried calling for help. They answered using my own voice. Day 45. Running low on supplies. They're still out there, waiting. Day 52. Found something in the old forestry records. This area was designated off-limits in 1887 after a mining incident. Whatever they dug up, it should have stayed buried. Day 63. Going to try to make it to the highway. If anyone finds this journal, don't trust anyone you meet in these woods. They copy perfectly, but they don't understand human emotion. That's how you can tell. The journal ended there. Emma was reading over my shoulder. What happened to him? I flipped through the rest of the notebook and found one final entry, written in different handwriting. Tom Bradley died trying to escape. His body was never found. If you're reading this, you're probably trapped like we were. The creatures can't enter this building, but they'll wait forever. The only way out is to understand what they really are. Below that, in the same handwriting, they're not aliens or monsters. They're echoes. Psychic imprints left behind by the people who died here. The mining incident in 1887 released something that feeds on human consciousness. It copies our thoughts, our fears, our memories. But it doesn't understand love or hope or any positive emotion. That's its weakness. I set the journal aside and looked at Emma. Echoes of the dead. So they're ghosts? Not exactly. More like recordings. They have our shapes and voices and memories, but not our souls. Outside, the sounds had died down. The creatures were still there. I could see their glowing eyes in the darkness. But they'd stopped trying to break in. So, how do we get out of here? Emma asked. I reread the journal entries looking for clues. Tom Bradley had tried to reach the highway and died. But he'd been alone. Maybe 2 people had a better chance. We wait for dawn, I said. Then we try to find the highway. What if we can't? What if we're stuck here forever? We're not going to be stuck here forever. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. The creatures outside had waited 3 years for Tom Bradley to come out. They could wait 3 more for us. Dawn came slowly, filtering through the gaps in the wallboards. As the light grew stronger, the glowing eyes outside began to fade. By the time the sun was fully up, the creatures had vanished. We gathered the remaining supplies and prepared to leave. I tucked Tom Bradley's journal into my pack. If we didn't make it out, maybe someone else would find it and learn from our mistakes. Emma tested her ankle. It was still swollen, but she could walk on it. "Ready?" I asked. She nodded, and I opened the door. The forest outside looked normal in the daylight. No sign of the creatures that had surrounded us all night, just tall pines and scattered undergrowth and the kind of pristine wilderness that belonged on a postcard. We started walking east, following my compass toward where the highway should be. The going was easier in daylight, and Emma's ankle seemed to be improving with movement. After an hour, we reached the edge of the forest. Below us stretched a valley filled with rolling grassland. In the distance, I could see a ribbon of asphalt cutting across the landscape. Highway 385, according to my map. "We made it," Emma said, hardly believing it. We stumbled down the slope toward the road, laughing and crying at the same time. A truck driver spotted us and pulled over, offering to take us to the nearest town. "What happened to you girls?" he asked as we climbed into his cab. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," I said. He drove us to Rapid City, where we gave statements to the police and Park Service. They organized search parties to look for Marcus and Jake, but they never found any trace of them. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead due to exposure. Emma and I knew better. They weren't dead. They were something else now, waiting in that impossible forest for the next group of hikers to find them. I moved away from South Dakota a month later, changed my name, my job, my entire life, but I still have nightmares about those glowing eyes and mechanical voices. Sometimes I wake up convinced that Emma isn't really Emma, that the thing that brought me out of the forest was just another copy. The rational part of my mind knows that's paranoia. Emma is Emma, the real Emma. She texts me every morning with some mundane detail about her day, what she had for breakfast, which students are giving her trouble, how her ankle is feeling. Little human details that the creatures could never understand. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder, how would I know if something had replaced her? How would I know if something had replaced me? The mining incident Tom Bradley mentioned was real. I researched it after we got out. In 1887, the Davenport Mining Company was excavating a new shaft when they broke through into a natural cave system. According to the newspaper reports, 17 miners died in the collapse that followed. But there were also reports of strange phenomena: missing time, people acting strangely, voices calling from empty tunnels. The mine was sealed and the area was quietly designated off-limits by the territorial government. It's been off-limits ever since. But boundaries on maps don't stop determined hikers, and the things in those woods are always hungry for new faces to copy. If you're reading this and you're planning to hike in the Black Hills, stay on the marked trails. Don't trust your GPS if it shows blank areas on the map. And if you encounter other hikers who seem just a little bit off, who ask for help with that same mechanical inflection, run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back, because they're still out there, wearing the faces of everyone who never made it home, still waiting, still hungry, still calling for help. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Black Hills of South Dakota, 3 miles southeast of Deadwood on the Centennial Trail, during the last week of October 2024. I should have known something was wrong when Sarah suggested the trip. Not because Sarah Rodriguez wasn't the adventurous type, she absolutely was, always dragging Michelle and me on weekend excursions to places we'd never heard of. But this time felt different. Sarah had been distant for weeks, canceling plans, avoiding eye contact during our monthly dinners. When she called that Tuesday evening, her voice carried an urgency that made my chest tighten. "We need to go camping," she said without preamble. "This weekend, the 3 of us." "Sarah, it's almost November," I replied, watching rain streak down my apartment window. "It's freezing and—" "Please, Jen, I need this. I need to get away from everything." The raw desperation in her voice cut through my protests. Sarah never asked for help, never admitted vulnerability. In our 8-year friendship, she'd been the rock, steady, confident, unshakable. Hearing her sound so broken felt like watching the ground crack beneath my feet. Michelle Young, our eternal peacekeeper, agreed immediately when I called her. "Of course we'll go," she said in that warm, maternal tone she'd perfected as a social worker. Sarah wouldn't ask unless she really needed us. That's how we found ourselves driving through the winding roads of the Black Hills on a gray Friday afternoon, Michelle's ancient Subaru loaded with camping gear that smelled faintly of mildew. The weather forecast had promised clear skies, but thick clouds hung low between the ponderosa pines, creating a premature twilight that made me grip the passenger seat harder than necessary. I've always been afraid of the dark, not just uncomfortable, genuinely, pathologically terrified, the kind of fear that sends me scrambling for light switches and keeps me awake listening to every creak and whisper in my apartment. My friends knew this about me, had known since college when I'd had a complete breakdown during a power outage. They'd never judged me for it, never made me feel weak. But as we drove deeper into the forest, watching shadows swallow the road behind us, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. Sarah sat in the back seat, staring out the window with an expression I couldn't read. She'd barely spoken during the 3-hour drive, responding to Michelle's cheerful chatter with grunts and one-word answers. Dark circles ringed her eyes, and her usually perfect ponytail hung limp and unwashed. "The turnoff should be coming up," Sarah said suddenly, her voice cutting through Michelle's story about her latest difficult case. "Right after the mile marker." I squinted at the GPS on my phone, but the screen showed only a spinning loading icon. "That's weird. I had full signal 5 minutes ago." "Mine too," Michelle said, tapping her phone mounted on the dashboard. "Maybe it's the trees." The turnoff Sarah mentioned appeared exactly where she'd said it would, a narrow dirt road barely wide enough for our car, marked by a weathered wooden sign I couldn't quite read in the gathering gloom. As we bumped along the rutted track, pine branches scraped against the windows with sounds like fingernails on glass. "Sarah, are you sure this is right?" I asked, my anxiety climbing with each yard we traveled from civilization. "This doesn't look like any campground I've ever seen." "It's primitive camping," Sarah replied. "More private, more peaceful." The road ended abruptly in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The trees formed an almost perfect circle, their dark branches interlocking overhead like clasped fingers. In the center of the clearing sat a ring of blackened stones, an old fire pit that looked like it hadn't been used in years. "This is perfect," Michelle said, though I caught the slight uncertainty in her voice. "Very secluded." We spent the next hour setting up camp in the fading light. The temperature had dropped noticeably since we'd left the main road, and my breath formed small clouds as I helped Michelle wrestle with her tent. Sarah worked alone, moving with mechanical efficiency as she assembled her gear. She'd brought camping equipment I'd never seen before, a military-style tent, a sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, and a massive backpack that looked like it could hold supplies for a week. "Planning to hike to Canada?" I joked, trying to lighten the mood. Sarah didn't smile. "Just like to be prepared." By the time we'd finished setting up, full darkness had fallen like a curtain dropping on a stage. The silence was absolute. No traffic, no voices, no sounds of civilization. Just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the occasional crack of a settling branch. I'd brought battery-powered lanterns, and their LED glow created a small bubble of safety around our tents, but beyond that circle lay an impenetrable wall of black. "Should we start a fire?" Michelle suggested, rubbing her hands together. "I brought marshmallows." I gathered kindling while Sarah arranged logs in the old fire ring. The wood was dry, perfect for burning, but when Sarah struck a match, the flame sputtered and died without catching. She tried again with the same result. "That's strange," Michelle said, kneeling beside the pit. "This should light easily." Sarah tried a third time, and this time the kindling caught, but the flames burned with an odd blue tinge that made my skin crawl. The fire gave off heat, but the light seemed dimmer than it should have been, as if the darkness around us was actively resisting illumination. "Must be minerals in the wood," Sarah said, but she didn't sound convinced. We ate dinner in relative quiet, canned chili heated over Sarah's camping stove, since none of us wanted to trust the strange fire with our food. The silence stretched between us like a living thing, broken only by the scrape of spoons against metal and the distant call of what might have been an owl. "So," Michelle said finally, clearly struggling to maintain her usual optimism, "what's the plan for tomorrow? There are supposed to be some great hiking trails around here." "I thought we might explore," Sarah said, staring into the blue flames. "There are things in these woods worth seeing." The way she said it sent ice down my spine. There was something in her tone, a hunger almost, that didn't sound like the Sarah I knew. "What kind of things?" I asked. Sarah's head turned toward me, and in the flickering firelight her eyes looked completely black. "Old things. Things that have been waiting." A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through me. Waiting for what? But Sarah had already turned back to the fire, and when she spoke again, her voice was normal. "Sorry. I'm just tired. It's been a long day." We stayed up for another hour, trying to recapture the easy camaraderie of our previous camping trips, but the conversation felt forced, artificial. Finally, Michelle declared herself exhausted and retreated to her tent. I should have followed her lead, but the thought of lying alone in the dark made my chest constrict with familiar panic. "I think I'll stay up a bit longer," I said, adding another log to the fire. "I'll keep you company," Sarah offered, but there was something eager in her voice that made me glance at her sharply. "Actually, I'm pretty tired too," I said quickly. "Big day tomorrow." Inside my tent, I lay fully clothed in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig, sent my heart racing. I'd brought a small LED flashlight that I clutched like a talisman, and I'd left one of the battery lanterns burning outside my tent, against all camping wisdom, but necessary for my sanity. I must have dozed, because I woke to the sound of voices. My phone showed 3:17 a.m., and the lantern outside had died, leaving me in absolute darkness. My flashlight beam revealed nothing when I pressed my face to the mesh window, but I could hear Sarah talking to someone just beyond the edge of our camp. The conversation was too quiet for me to make out words, but there was definitely someone else out there. My heart hammered against my ribs as I listened, trying to decide whether to wake Michelle or investigate myself. The voices continued for several more minutes before fading into silence. I lay awake until dawn, jumping at every sound. Michelle was already awake when I emerged from my tent the next morning, crouched beside the dead fire pit with a concerned expression. "Sarah's gone," she said without preamble. My blood turned to ice water. "What do you mean, gone?" "Her tent's empty, sleeping bag's still zipped up, but she's not in it." Michelle gestured toward Sarah's tent, which stood open and vacant. "Her backpack's missing, too." I told Michelle about the voices I'd heard, and we spent the next hour calling Sarah's name and searching the immediate area. There was no response, no sign of which direction she might have gone. The forest seemed to swallow our voices, returning only empty echoes that sounded wrong somehow, distorted and mocking. "Maybe she went for an early hike," Michelle suggested, but her voice betrayed her worry. "You know how she is about watching sunrises." We waited, made coffee over Michelle's camp stove, ate granola bars that tasted like cardboard, called Sarah's name until our voices were hoarse. As the hours crawled by, Michelle grew increasingly frantic while I battled my own rising panic. The idea of Sarah lost in these woods, of having to spend another night here, of potentially having to hike out in the dark, made my vision blur with terror. It was just after noon when Sarah walked back into our camp. She emerged from the tree line to the east, moving with her usual confident stride, backpack still in place. But something was wrong. It took me several seconds to identify what, and when I did, my stomach clenched with inexplicable dread. Sarah wasn't blinking. "There you are!" Michelle rushed toward her. "We were so worried. Where did you go?" "Exploring," Sarah said, and her voice sounded exactly the same as always, but her eyes remained fixed and unblinking. "Found some interesting things." "You should have left a note," Michelle said, relief making her almost giddy. "We thought something had happened to you." Sarah's head turned toward Michelle with mechanical precision. Something did happen to me. The smile that spread across Sarah's face was all wrong. Too wide, revealing too many teeth, and it never reached her unblinking eyes. I felt my body go cold as every instinct screamed that this was not my friend. "What do you mean?" Michelle asked, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice now. I met someone, Sarah said, still smiling that horrible smile. Someone who's been waiting a very long time to meet us. I backed away instinctively, my hand moving to the can of bear spray clipped to my belt. Sarah's head swiveled toward me with that same mechanical movement, and I saw something move behind her eyes, something dark and ancient and hungry. Jennifer, Sarah said, and my name sounded like a curse in her mouth. You look frightened. There's no need to be frightened. Not yet. Michelle was still trying to process what was happening. Sarah, you're scaring us. Are you feeling okay? Did you hit your head, or... Sarah's hand shot out faster than any human should be able to move, fingers wrapping around Michelle's throat. Michelle's eyes went wide with shock and terror as Sarah lifted her off the ground with impossible strength. I feel better than I have in years, Sarah said conversationally, watching Michelle's face turn purple. Better than I ever felt when I was her. I fumbled for the bear spray, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the safety clip. Sarah turned those dead, unblinking eyes toward me. I wouldn't, she said. Not unless you want to watch her suffer more than necessary. Let her go, I whispered. Please, Sarah, let her go. Sarah's not here anymore, the thing wearing my friend's face replied. She invited me in last night. She was so tired, so desperate for relief from all that pain she'd been carrying. I offered her rest, and she accepted. Now I'm here, and she's somewhere else. Michelle's struggles were growing weaker. I could see the life fading from her eyes. What do you want? I asked desperately. What I've always wanted, Sarah's voice said. To not be alone. To have companions for the long journey ahead. Sarah was just the beginning. There are so many others who need what I can give them. So many people tired of fighting, tired of hurting, ready to let someone else take control. The thing wearing Sarah's face tilted its head, studying me with those horrible, unblinking eyes. You, for instance. You're so afraid, Jennifer. So tired of being afraid. I could take that fear away, take all of it away. You'd never have to be afraid of the dark again. Because I'd be dead, I whispered. Not dead. Changed. Improved. Sarah isn't dead. She's just resting. And when you stop fighting, when you let me in, you'll understand how much better this is. Michelle's eyes rolled back in her head, and her body went limp. The thing that had been Sarah dropped her carelessly to the ground like a discarded toy. No, I screamed, finally getting the bear spray free and triggering it in Sarah's direction. The spray hit the thing square in the face, but it didn't even flinch. Instead, it laughed, a sound like breaking glass that made my teeth ache. That was rude, it said, wiping chemical foam from its cheeks. I was being polite, giving you a choice. But if you want to do this the hard way... I ran. I crashed through the undergrowth like a panicked animal, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, I could hear the thing that had been Sarah following at a leisurely pace, not even breathing hard. There's nowhere to go, Jennifer, it called, voice carrying impossibly far through the trees. These woods are mine now. They've been mine for longer than you can imagine. Every path leads back to me. I ran anyway because it was all I could do. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror drove me forward through the darkening forest. The sun was setting already. Too early, it felt like we'd only had a few hours of daylight, and my worst fear was rushing toward me with the dying light. I stumbled into a small clearing I didn't recognize and stopped, gasping for breath. Nothing looked familiar. The trees seemed taller here, older, their branches forming a canopy so thick that almost no light penetrated to the forest floor. In the center of the clearing sat a circle of standing stones that definitely hadn't been there before, ancient-looking things covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. Beautiful, isn't it? Sarah's voice came from directly behind me. I spun around, heart nearly stopping. She stood at the edge of the clearing, still wearing that terrible smile, still not blinking. How did you... I was ahead of you. These are my woods now, the thing said. I can be wherever I choose to be. The stones are old, Jennifer. Older than the people who carved those symbols. They've been waiting here, holding open a door that should have stayed closed. Sarah found them last night. She cut her palm on one of the sharp edges, just a small cut, barely worth noticing. But it was enough. I backed toward the center of the clearing, trying to keep the stone circle between us. "What are you?" I whispered. "I'm what comes through when the door opens. What feeds on fear and desperation and pain. I've been trapped in the dark between worlds for so very long, and I'm hungry. Hungry for experience, for sensation, for life." The thing tilted Sarah's head. "Do you know what it's like to be alone in absolute darkness for centuries? To have nothing but hunger and hate to keep you company?" "That's not my problem," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "But it could be your solution," the thing replied. "Let me in, Jennifer. Stop fighting. It doesn't hurt when you stop fighting. Like it didn't hurt Michelle." Something flickered across the thing's face. Annoyance, maybe, or disappointment. Michelle fought. She shouldn't have fought. If she'd accepted me willingly, like Sarah did, she could have shared this body. Instead, she made me take what I needed by force. The thing shrugged Sarah's shoulders. Wasteful, really. But I have her memories now, her knowledge, her experiences. She lives on, in a way. "You're insane." "I'm hungry," the thing corrected. "And you're going to feed me, one way or another. The only question is whether you want to do it willingly or if I'll have to break you first." I looked around desperately for an escape route, but the trees seemed to press closer with every passing second. Darkness was falling fast now, and my flashlight felt pathetically small in my hand. "The dark doesn't bother me," the thing said, reading my fear with horrible accuracy. "In fact, I prefer it. It's where I'm strongest, where I'm most myself." As if in response to its words, my flashlight flickered and dimmed. I smacked it against my palm, but the beam continued to fade until it was barely more than a glowworm's worth of light. "No, no, no," I muttered, shaking the flashlight frantically. "Yes," the thing whispered, and suddenly it was right beside me, moving without sound across the forest floor. "Let the darkness come, Jennifer. Let it take away all that fear." Sarah's hand touched my cheek and her skin was ice cold and dry as paper. I jerked away, stumbling backward toward the stone circle. "Don't touch me." "I'm going to do much more than touch you," the thing said, and Sarah's voice carried promises of violation that made my soul recoil. "I'm going to wear you, use you, walk around in your skin and see the world through your eyes. And you'll be along for the ride, screaming silently in the back of your own mind." My heel caught on one of the standing stones, and I fell backward, my palm slicing open on the rough edge exactly as Sarah's must have. Blood welled up, dark in the fading light, and something changed in the air around us. The symbols on the stones began to glow with a sickly phosphorescent light, and a wind that came from nowhere started to moan through the trees. "Perfect," the thing said, and for the first time it looked genuinely pleased. "Your blood will open the door wider. Call more of my kind through. This little campsite was just the beginning. Soon the whole forest will be ours. Then the towns. Then the cities." I pressed my bleeding hand against my shirt, but the damage was done. The wind was getting stronger, and I could hear something else now. Voices in the distance, calling from places that shouldn't exist. Other things, hungry and ancient and waiting for their chance to cross over. "This is what Sarah wanted," the thing continued, moving closer with predatory grace. She was so tired of being alone, so ready to be part of something larger. She opened the door willingly, gladly. "And when I'm wearing your skin, you'll help me find others just as lost, just as desperate. We'll build a family, Jennifer, a beautiful, hungry family." The wind reached a howling crescendo, and the glow from the stones became blindingly bright. Through the light I could see shapes moving, dark things with too many limbs, things that dragged themselves across dimensions toward our world. But then something unexpected happened. My phone, forgotten in my pocket since we'd lost signal, suddenly buzzed with an incoming call. The screen lit up like a beacon in the darkness, and the caller ID showed my mother's name. just a normal, mundane connection to the world of the living. The thing wearing Sarah's face hissed and stepped backward, raising its hands to shield its eyes from the phone's light. "Turn it off," it snarled, all pretense of humanity dropping from its voice. "Turn it off now." But I didn't turn it off. Instead, I answered the call, and my mother's voice came through the speaker, worried and loving and completely, reassuringly normal. "Jenny? Sweetheart, are you okay? I've been trying to reach you all day. Your dad and I were—" "Mom," I sobbed, clutching the phone like a lifeline. "Mom, I'm in trouble. I'm lost in the Black Hills and something's wrong with Sarah and—" "Honey, slow down. Are you hurt? Do you need us to call the ranger station?" The thing was backing away now, its form seeming to flicker and fade in the phone's light. The voices from beyond the stones were growing fainter, and the wind was dying down. "I need help," I said into the phone. "I need someone to come find me. Sarah's dead, Michelle's dead, and there's something here that—" "I'm calling 911 right now," my mother said firmly. "Stay on the line with me, baby. Don't hang up." "I won't," I promised, though I could barely speak through my tears. "I won't hang up." The thing that had been Sarah was nearly transparent now, its form wavering like heat mirage. The phone's connection to the outside world, to life and love and normality, was somehow poisonous to it. "This isn't over," it whispered, voice fading like smoke. "I know where you live now. I've seen through Sarah's eyes. When the phone dies, when the batteries run out, when you're alone in the dark again, I'll be waiting." Then it was gone, vanishing like a shadow in sunlight. The stones stopped glowing, the wind stilled, and the forest returned to its natural darkness. But this time, the darkness felt normal again, just absence of light, not the hungry, living thing it had been before. I stayed on the phone with my mother for 3 hours until the search and rescue team found me. They followed the signal from my phone, their flashlights cutting through the forest like swords of salvation. I'd never been so happy to see strangers in my life. The official report stated that Sarah Rodriguez and Michelle Young died in a hiking accident. Sarah's body was found at the bottom of a ravine, her neck broken from the fall. Michelle was discovered near our campsite, cause of death listed as cardiac arrest brought on by a previously undiagnosed heart condition. I was treated for shock, dehydration, and exposure. No one believed my story about possession and ancient entities. The therapist my insurance company assigned me to see suggested I'd suffered a psychotic break brought on by the trauma of watching my friends die. The standing stones, probably just rocks arranged by previous campers. The symbols, pareidolia, seeing patterns where none existed, the thing that wore Sarah's face, grief and guilt manifesting as hallucinations. I let them believe what they wanted to believe. It was easier than fighting, but I know what I saw. I know what happened in those woods, and I know the thing was right about one thing. It isn't over. I moved back in with my parents after the incident. Sold my apartment, quit my job, couldn't bear the thought of being alone. I keep every light in the house burning from sunset to sunrise. I never go anywhere without multiple flashlights and backup batteries. My phone is always charged, always ready to connect me to the world of the living. Because sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and the darkness presses against the windows, I hear Sarah's voice calling my name. Sometimes I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, a familiar silhouette that shouldn't be there. Sometimes I wake up to find my bedroom door standing open, though I always lock it before going to sleep. The thing is still out there, still hungry, still patient. It knows where I am. It knows I'm afraid. And it knows that eventually, inevitably, I'll have to face the darkness again. When that happens, when my phone finally dies, or the power goes out, or I find myself alone and afraid with nowhere left to run, it will be waiting. Sarah will be waiting. And this time, there might not be anyone left to call for help. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Black Hills of South Dakota, 3 miles southeast of Deadwood on the Centennial Trail, during the last week of October 2024. I survived, but I'm not sure for how long.